Got just about everybody now, folks. Let me give you a quick little recap to start off this amazing night of education. Now, before, I'm going to kind of go through and make sure, everybody is muted just to start off. We have already covered a lot of information, okay? Night one, we started talking about, the licensing application, some things to be aware of leading up to the test, and got into a tiny bit of material after all was said and done. Last night, we really started diving into a very specific section of North Carolina testable material, and that is the licensing statuses, the education, the active versus current, the criteria to move from one status to another. Now, the one thing that we didn't really get into a lot of detail last night is the BIC piece. And the reason is, to be honest with you, this stuff is so out of left field and kind of abstract for most people as they start teaching it, that if I told you all of it, you're more likely to get jumbled. So I gave you some insight into the criteria for BIC yesterday, but we're not going to actually get into the full in-depth conversation of BICs now. What I typically like to do is when we circle back around to similar concepts with license law and commission rules and North Carolina specific stuff later, we'll bring the BICs into the mix at that time. And so we'll have conversations about the BIC's obligations under license law and commission rule, as well as the criteria to be one. So I'm not going to teach it to you. It's just not going to show up in this section of slides, but it will absolutely come up later. So let me share my screen with you. You folks should all recall this slide. This is the last slide that we left off on. Okay, and so we talked about provisional brokers, and so let me just make sure that I'm going to quiz you a little bit just to make sure you're comfortable. Folks, what you got?
Do you want to be recording?
Absolutely, Kirsten. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
The good news is, folks, I'll say this, so I do appreciate you saying that. The only thing that technically is recording is the slides, and so it just makes my editing time easier, because then I have like a timed overlay, because I always record the video footage separately on a Canon camera right here. So like, you will not miss any audio in any way, shape, or form. It is all existent, but I do appreciate it because it really helps my recording time, or my editing time. Bam.
Recording in progress.
Thank you. So, provisional broker, folks. How long can you be a provisional broker for in North Carolina?
18 months.
18 months. 18 months. More specifically, I will amend that statement to say, well, technically you have to... Oh, Manoj, were you about to say something, Manoj? I'm going to help you out. You're just unmuted there for a second. More specifically, you can only legally operate as a provisional broker for 18 months. And so let me just kind of expand on that question. Right? You're all right. When you get your license, it's issued on inactive status and provisional status in North Carolina. And so you could then turn around as a provisional broker and activate your license. As soon as you get it, folks, how do you activate your license as a provisional broker?
Be affiliated with a BIC.
There you go. You got to have somebody to supervise you, a broker in charge or a firm, which also has to have a BIC. So really, it's have a BIC. So let's say that you activate your license. You can start playing real estate as an active... Let's try to work on these technical difficulties. Makes it a little hard for me to teach with the sounds and the random things like that. You can activate your license as a provisional broker, and you can start playing real estate under the supervision of a broker in charge. And so you were only allowed to do real estate as a provisional broker for 18 months. And so in theory, you could be a real estate broker, a provisional broker longer than that. It's just that you can never activate your license again after kind of that statutory 18-month period. And so remember what I told you. If you were active, and playing real estate and you did not get your post-licensing classes done and that 18-month mark hit, what would happen to your license? What would happen to it?
It would go inactive.
Inactive. And that is a very specific word, inactive. Okay? Inactive is what happens due to some education deficiency. And we can agree that that's exactly what happens if you don't get your post-licensing done as a provisional broker. An education deficiency. You did not meet a deadline for education. So that is a provisional broker. Okay? You get issued on provisional status. It's also on inactive status. You can activate it as soon as you get it if you have a BIC. You can play real estate as a provisional broker for 18 months. But if you do not move to full broker within that time period, you would go inactive until you get all of your post-licensing courses done and move to full broker or non-provisional, whatever we'd like to call it. What you got, Jacob?
Okay, I thought of two questions.
Sure.
During the day today. Okay, so my two questions are, provisional brokers can take, or actually, it's just one question.
Okay.
Never mind. But when you are in an exemption situation for having your license, such as being a W-2 employee, correct? Where you are able to do some things, but not everything. Can you accept referrals?
No. Referral is a brokerage activity. And so the exemptions are so very specific. And so I want you to think about it. So let's say that I was a broker property manager and you were my employee. It's very specific exemptions for you not needing a license. Like I told you yesterday, you can show properties for lease. You can collect rent checks and tenant security deposits for me. You can instruct or give potential tenants, places where to sign. But if a tenant comes in and then, you show them a place for lease and then they're like, oh, we've also considered buying. And then you turn around and you send them to, Corey, a licensed real estate broker, to buy, and you expect a fee. That is just a direct referral fee. Do you see what I'm saying? Like, it is a very specific set of exemptions under those different categories of exemptions. Not a full-fledged exemption. None of them are a full-fledged exemption, right? It's just very specific within. Think about it. One of the exemptions is if you're the owner. Well, that doesn't mean that you can now collect referral fees for other properties. It is very specific constraints within all the exemptions. Does that make sense? Yeah. Good deal. So, how do you move from provisional to full broker?
90 hours of post-licensing.
90 hours of post-licensing. That's it. 3 30-hour courses, 301, 302, 303. No particular order that you have to take them in. Okay, so let me give you the next question to help you recap from what we talked about yesterday. Do you need a broker in charge if you're a full broker?
No, but you can't advertise.
There you go. Remember, a broker, whether we're talking about national or state, a broker technically can operate independently. And so North Carolina, that's still true, even though we've got these 3 different categories. But as Jacob just said, you are very limited in what you can do as a full broker. You can help people buy houses if you do not solicit them in any way, shape, and form, meaning they already know you're a broker, and you can be paid for it because you're an active real estate broker. And you can collect referral fees as long as you don't solicit them because you're an active real estate broker. But the reason why that's kind of not the desired way to go in North Carolina is because you cannot advertise, you cannot have a trust account, and you cannot affiliate other brokers. So this is where you got to watch and be very specific on the North Carolina portion of the test. If the question is, can a non-provisional broker assist a buyer in purchasing a home and collect a commission? Yes. Because they are a full broker, as long as they're on active status. But if the question was, could they advertise their services of brokerage? The answer is no. So it's very specific. So I told you we're not going to get into the crazy details of BIC yet, but who remembers what I told you the qualifications were to become a BIC yesterday? At least one of them is one we touched on pretty in depth.
2 years of on-the-job experience.
There you go. 2 years of full-time brokerage experience within the past 5 years.
Four years part-time.
There you go. Or 4 years of part-time experience within the past 5 years. And then the other big testable criteria, I'll go ahead and drop them here, active and non-provisional. Okay? Those are the three main criteria to become a BIC or BIC eligible broker. Now, there is supplemental education. And I'll give you a little bit more on that in just a second. But those are the three main criteria to be BIC or BIC eligible broker. 2 years of full-time experience in the past 5 years, 4 years of part-time experience within the past 5 years, active and non-provisional. Those are the minimum criteria. So we also talked about the LNCL, the Limited Non-Resident Commercial License, a very specific category. It's for people who don't live in North Carolina. It is for commercial real estate only, and it is a temporary license. It's exactly what it sounds like. And then we also talked about firm licenses. Folks, who, what, when, where, why gets a firm license?
An entity.
An entity.
Caldwell Banker Remax.
There you
use that for examples.
There you go. All of those are brokerage firms. They've created an entity, and only they would get firm licenses. What do we call it if somebody is running the business through themselves without a firm and they're just using their broker's license?
Sole proprietor.
There you go. Sole proprietorship. Now, I said technically the sole proprietor is the individual. Sole proprietorship would be, the individual that could potentially have other brokers affiliated, but you will get more context in that in any test questions. So, where we ended up yesterday evening is into some really important and really testable license statuses above and beyond just provisional versus non-provisional versus BIC. And so those four statuses that go in hand with that is you can be active or inactive and current or expired, okay? Active, inactive, current, expired. And so we've got to understand the different combinations and the time frames and all these things. So we mentioned this yesterday, okay? I told you that your brokerage license year, it runs in a weird way. It runs from July 1 to June 30th of the next year. So as I'm sitting here teaching you this, I am sitting in the 2023-2024 licensing year is what we call it. Told you it starts in the year that the July is, and then it ends in the year that the June is. And so this current year started at July 1 of 2023. This current year will end on June 30th of 2024. Does that statement make sense for everybody?
Yes.
Yes. So the reason why this is significant is because you have to renew your license every single year, no later than June 30th. Every single year. Go ahead.
Sorry, I have a quick question.
For sure.
You said no later than June 30th, so is there like a day that it can start, or you can do it any time during that time frame?
There is a period of time that only runs from May 15th to June 30th. So you basically have a month and a half window. Okay, May 15th to June 30th is when you can pay it.
So like 45 days.
You're like 45 days. That's exactly right. And so if you do not pay, we call it a renewal fee, right? It's renewing your license. If you do not pay your renewal fee, right? This is all about money. What would be the status of your license on July 1?
Inactive.
Nope.
Expired.
Expired. And this is where you got to be careful, right? And this, folks, this is a very hard concept because these are not terminologies that you've ever used in this way before. You know these terms. These terms are all familiar, but not in this way. And so remember, I want you to think of this like a parking meter. Like an old school parking meter, because nowadays, what do you use? You use a parking app on your phone, right? You're just like, okay, 103B, and then you're just like, I can just renew it from the bar, okay? It's in the technology, right? It's a great time to be alive. An old school parking meter, one that Jacob has never seen in his life, okay? The parking meters that existed before Jacob was, no, I'm kidding, I'm sure he's seen one. Folks, when you put those quarters into the parking meter, it says current. If it runs out of money, it's big red, expired. Your license does the exact same thing. Your license expires every year on June 30th. Right? Jacob's like, what's a quarter? Can I just Venmo this thing? Is that no, I can't. It takes a coin? What's a coin, right? Like Bitcoin, right? No, not that either. So, currency keeps your license current. Failure to pay expenses will make you expired. So, if you don't pay by June 30th, your license is expired. I'm going to talk about the punishments in a second, and that's kind of where we'll wrap up this section. And then we're going to move on into bigger and better things tonight. So the other terminology is active versus inactive. Okay? And so you all know that when you get your license issued as a provisional broker, it is issued starting out on which of those two?
Inactive.
Inactive. And you can only activate it by affiliating with a firm / broker in charge. But aside from the provisional broker conundrum, the only other thing that really makes you inactive is your standard education deficiencies. So I told you that you have to take CE every year starting when? How did I articulate it?
The year after your first renewal.
There you go. There are two different ways that you will see this written out on your test. It could say after your first renewal year or during your second renewal year. Both would be true. Because after you've renewed once, you move on to your second renewal year. Yeah, same thing. It's just written different. So please don't let that trip you up on a test. It's just basically you would need it by June 10th, just before you paid your renewal fee the second time. And then you would need it forever and ever and ever until the day you die or turn in your real estate license. Now, folks, I'm going to tell y'all something right now. I don't know if y'all know this, okay? I'm going to scare you a little bit. Listen, if nobody told you this, you're not allowed to retire from real estate. You didn't know this? You just have to die one day. You know how I know this? When I got my license, I wasn't too much older than you, Jacob. I was in my mid-20s, okay? Just a few years older than you when I got my license. And I joined a firm. And when I got to the office, the average age of the agents in my office was like 170 or something like that. I mean, it was up there. And so I'm sitting there at a sales meeting, and there's this lovely lady, and she would come to all the sales meetings. Folks, this woman, she was older. And she came in every day with her walker at a 90-degree angle. And this woman is just as spry as you could possibly, just with her walker coming to these sales meetings. And I'm just sitting there as a mid-20-something broker and new in the business. And I just looked at somebody and was like, we don't get to retire. That's not a thing. We have to die one day. Okay. No, nobody told me that we just had to die one day and that this was it. Like but I'm cool. Everything's cool, right? But like nobody told me this. So I'm just letting y'all know that you don't get to retire from real estate. You just have to die one day. Okay. It's just, sorry to be the bearer of bad news. That's the way it works. So you have to take CE every year until the day you die or turn in your license. And as I mentioned yesterday, it is 8 hours every year. And those 8 hours are comprised of a 4-hour update course and a 4-hour elective course. So update depends on your status. And I mentioned this last night. If you are a full broker or a provisional broker, because understand that it is possible to be a provisional broker still and need to get CE done. And in fact, that's exactly what will happen to all of you folks. If you get licensed around April, May, and then you don't move, within a year or so to a full broker, you'll be a provisional broker still required to get your CE done prior to June 10th of 2025. So keep that in mind. So if you are a full broker or a provisional broker who needs their update, it is called GenUp, which is short for General Update. If you are a BIC or BIC eligible broker who needs an update course, it is called BICUp. Now, as it sits right now, they are basically the same course, just with added material for the BICs. So that's why we just say 4 hours of update. Which update course you take would be dependent on your licensing status. There is no differentiation between electives. There are over 480 or something approved electives. And so it's just take an elective approved by the Real Estate Commission with an approved school. And that satisfies your elective credit. And so your status, in order to do real estate brokerage, always has to be current and active. If you are anything other than current and active, you cannot do real estate in any way, shape, or form. So you could potentially be current and inactive. So when you get your license, that's what you'll be, a provisional broker who is current because you just had your license issued, but you will be issued on an inactive status. Or let's say you become a full broker and you pay your dues. Well, that would make you current, but then when you don't when you don't take your CE on time, you'll have an education deficiency and you will go inactive. Okay? So it is possible to be current and active and current and inactive, but only one of them allows you to play real estate. Is that statement okay? But if you are expired, folks, it is a standalone status. You cannot be expired and active. That is an oxymoron. It doesn't make sense. So let's say that you get your education done, but then you don't pay your dues. Yay, you for getting your education done, but you're still just expired. Expired is having no license at all. You basically have to have it reinstated. Now, the punishment is not terrible, but it's not a fun thing by any means. And I'll give you more on that in a second. But if you don't pay your dues, do not ever think that you're anything other than expired. Expired is standalone. It's too powerful. There's nothing else. Until you get that reinstated, you can be nothing other than expired, whether you took your classes or not. That make sense? Just letting it sink in for a second. I know it's a lot. Just right off the bat. I know. Going for blood. I'm sorry.
So basically, you have to pay like $45 every year and take 8 hours of CE course.
That's exactly right. Now, every year after your first renewal year for the CE courses, right? And now, because that is an important distinction for the test. So like if you get a test question that says, hey, you just got licensed on July 1, do you need CE by June 10th of the next year? The answer is no in North Carolina. If you got licensed on March 20th, do you need CE by June 10th of the following year? The answer is absolutely, because you will have renewed in June. Does that make sense? So that's a very important distinction for the test. But for like the real world, yeah, once you start taking CE, in order to stay current and active, it is $45 every year, 8 hours of continuing education every year. Yep.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Which is well worth it to not have to end up back in this class like some of our friends have, right? A couple of you back in this class because you didn't do this stuff every single year. And so it's important to know a few extra things here. Stephanie already asked this question. And so the answer is, I know, look, my entirety in my life, if y'all were a good class, which y'all are, the entirety of my life is having to answer questions that I'm about to answer, but it's good because that means you are thinking about very important things. So it's a good problem, okay? But it's not my first rodeo. I'm used to it. So you can pay your renewal fee as early as May 15th. You can't pay any earlier than that. Also understand they don't accept cash. They don't accept checks. They don't accept Venmo. They don't accept Cash App, okay? You have to pay via credit card on the Real Estate Commission's website. That's all they take. That's not really going to be on your test, but I'm just telling you that. So which licenses need to be renewed? Any licenses you have. If you have a broker's license, you need to renew it. It's $45. If you have a firm license, you need to renew it. It's $45. And if you have an LNCL, you have to renew it. I don't know if it's $45 or not, but it's not on your test, so it doesn't matter. So broker's license, firm licenses. So if we had a scenario where we said, Sandeep has a brokerage firm and a firm license, and he's got his individual broker's license, how much does Sandeep have to pay to renew his license or licenses? It would be $90, right? $45 for each. So renewal fee is $45, whichever license we're talking about. And it has to be paid, as I told you, no later than June 30th. Otherwise, your license is expired. This is just reiterating what I've already told you. Nobody panic. It's not new information. And so as I keep telling you, you're going to find that we're going to use a lot of plays on words, mnemonics, acronyms to try to help you remember different concepts. And that's where I keep saying this: currency keeps you current. Failure to pay expenses will make you expired. Now, I'm going to let this sink in for one more second, and then I'm going to tell you just rather briefly what the punishment is. I'm not going to go into it in crazy in depth yet because, I think that this is a lot to handle, and this is so important. I want this to sink in before I start throwing extra layers onto it. So, I told you when you are expired, it is standalone. You cannot do anything. It's the same as having no license at all. So it doesn't matter if you got your education done. Yet again, these are where you got to be careful on test questions, right? Dejay took, 12 hours of CE this year, 4 more than she needed to. And then didn't take or didn't pay their dues. What's the current status of the license? You've got to understand that you can't say active and expired. So if they give you that option, don't say that, right? It's just expired. If they tell you that somebody took 700 hours of class, doesn't matter. They're still expired if they don't pay their dues, okay? They will try to trick you in some ways on these things to make sure that you know that expired is a standalone status. If it's expired, it's just expired until we correct that. And then we could potentially deal with, more. Or have different statuses. Oops, let me readjust my cameras here. So let me talk about the punishments now, folks. Okay, now that you understand that, it's not good, inactive, bad, expired, bad. But here's the thing. Education can always be fixed. Expired, not necessarily. So if you let your license go expired, okay, well, you don't have a license right now. And you can't do any real estate brokerage. But what your punishment is depends on how long you have let your license be expired for. And so on July 1, where your license has been expired for not even a full day, it is the same punishment for that day as it is up to less than 6 months, okay? If you're expired from 1 day up to 6 months, the punishment is, instead of $45, now it's doubled. It's $90. And then you have to fill out some questions, and they will reinstate your license. So that's sucks. It's double, but it's fixable. If you let your license go expired for longer than 6 months, but less than 2 years, it's $90 still. You have to get a new background check. You have to fill out a new reinstatement application, and then they punish you even more on top of that. In order to get your license back, you will either have to elect to take the North Carolina State Licensing exam again, or take a post-licensing class again. So they basically give you some type of punishment if you let your license expire for greater than 6 months but less than 2 years. If you let your license go expired for 2 years or more, you're back in pre-licensing. This class, starting over. Now, there's one technicality that is, I doubt it's testable in any way, shape, and form. The way that they look at it, and I'm just going to tell you because I'd rather have too much information than not enough. If you're expired for over 2 years but less than 3 years, and you were a full broker when you went expired, they will reinstate you as a full broker. So yes, you do have to go back through pre-licensing. Yes, you do have to take the exam again. Yes, you do have to do a background check. You have to do all that. But they're not going to make you take post-licensing again. If you are expired for more than 3 years, starting at the beginning, and you are reinstated as a provisional broker at that point, right? So you would have to go through all the post-licensing again. I don't think that distinction between 2 and 3 years is testable. Just focus on the concept that you're back in pre-licensing. If you're expired for more than 2 years, I think that's going to be the main thing they kind of harp on there. But it's still okay with everything I'm dishing out at you. So active versus inactive, I told you education, up to date on your education is how you stay active. Now, let me explain the punishment for your inactive license. If you, as I said before, are a provisional broker and you do not get things done within your 18 months, you go inactive, but as soon as you get your post-licensing done, and as long as you have no other educational deficiencies, you can just reactivate. Your broker in charge just has to fill out a form. The only punishment is cease and desist. Now, this is important, folks. If you were active and in the middle of a transaction, you have to stop working on it immediately. You can do nothing with it. You are not allowed to do illegal brokerage activity in any way, shape, and form. So if your license goes inactive or expired in the middle of a transaction, cease and desist. The commission basically says if you do anything illegal, you have forfeit your commission. You're not allowed to collect a dime if you've done any illegal brokerage.
You said that if the punishment for inactive is if you don't do your continuing education, once you've completed that, you can become active with the signature from the BIC. Is that what you said?
So hold on, not continuing education. We were talking about the provisional brokers first.
Okay.
So if you were a provisional broker on active status, but then you failed to get your post-licensing done within 18 months, once you get your post-licensing done and become a full broker, all your BIC has to do is fill out a form. It is called Form 2.08. It is a broker activation and affiliation form. So once they go and reactivate you through this form, then you can play real estate again. That's all it takes. Your BIC just has to reactivate you.
Okay.
Yep. I just want to, that's right, Josh. Jacob helped you out. If you are expired for 2 years or more, back in pre-licensing. 2 years or more, back in pre-licensing. Yeah. So let's talk about the CE side of things, okay? Because that's going to be the more testable than the provisional. You could potentially see them both. But here's what you have to understand, okay? Let's say that Sam is a provisional broker, full broker, doesn't matter. And Sam is in a point in her career where she needs to get her CE done by June 10th. Oops, Sam forgot, all right? She didn't get it done. Remember, I told you, you cannot take your CE between June 11th and June 30th. It's what we call a blackout period in North Carolina. We do not offer CE. So Sam's license would be active up to and including June 30th, but there is nothing that Sam could do to stop from going inactive on July 1. It's kind of like a horror movie where you see all the people like the murderers behind the curtains, and you see the woman walk in there and you're like, no, he's behind the curtain, he's going to kill you, don't do it. And no matter how much you try to warn her, there's nothing that will save anybody in that horror movie. It's the same thing with your license. You just have to sit there and watch it go inactive. There's nothing you can do to stop it. So on July 1, when you have this education deficiency, you're inactive because you missed your 8 hours of CE. Well, the commission does not just make you fix it. Here's the difference. They punish you yet again. What they basically say is, well, because you can't be trusted to take your classes on time, go ahead and take your 8 hours for the new year, meaning your 4-hour update, your 4-hour elective for the new year that just kicked off in July, and take 8 hours of elective to make up for what you missed in your previous year. So you cannot reactivate until you take a total of 16 hours. Now, it's not that it's not fair, because it's really the 8 hours you missed plus the 8 hours for the new year. So you're already done for that year. You have nothing to take by the next June 10th at that point. It just makes you ahead of the game. But you're not allowed to reactivate until you take those 16 hours. Now, the reason why I said 2 hours of two elective classes, 2 4-hour elective classes to make up for the previous year, is because I told you general update is only taught in the year that it's issued in. The update course changes every year. You cannot go back and make it up. Once the year ends, we're only teaching a different version of update. So the way that they make up for it is they say, we'll take an elective to make up for the update you missed the previous year. Everybody feeling okay? Monica, you're looking real pensive over there. I'm just making sure. Yeah, just taking it all in? Yeah, okay. That's good. That's great. You're focused. I like that. I can see it. She's right in there. Now, the good news is, folks, I'm kind of just about to wrap up beating this stuff over your heads. I just find that, like, because I worry about how much is going to be on the North Carolina test, I like to get this in right off the bat because the North Carolina test is the hardest. So while your brains are fresh, I think it's really good to start kind of shove some of this down your throats, as they say. And then, of course, I'll kind of circle back around and we'll get into some national concepts here in just a second. So, active status is education. Education can always be fixed. If you go longer than, behind like a year for your CE or 2 years or 3 years, they just start making you take post-licensing classes to make up for hours missed. But education can always be fixed as long as you pay your dues every single year. You can always fix education. It's just going to vary.
Can you elaborate a little bit on if your license get either inactive or expire, but prior to that, you was already engulfed into a transaction and maybe you might be getting a commission coming to you?
Yeah.
How's that handled?
Excellent question. So Tim's question is, okay, well, yeah, I'm telling you that you might go inactive, you might go expired. So if you are in fact in a transaction, active or current, and then in the midst of that transaction, you go inactive or expired, and you would potentially be due a commission, what does that look like? Okay, so here's the answer. In North Carolina, we have a rule that states that you can, here's a very important keyword, can be paid for things you did while you were current and active, so long as you do not do any brokerage activity once you go inactive or expired. Now, let me tell you why that keyword is can. Let's say that I'm your broker in charge, Tim, and you got 123 Main Street under contract. And 3 days before it closes, where you are about to make a $10,000 commission check, you go inactive. Well, Tim, you better not go to closing and you better not call those clients. But since I'm your BIC, I'm going to look after you and I'm going to say, Tim, I've got this. Okay, go work on getting your license fixed and then we'll figure this out. And so if it goes to closing, remember the check's going to come through the firm first and we'll talk more about that later. And so then I could legally pay you your $10,000, Tim, because I finished the transaction out. You didn't do any illegal brokerage activity. I was still legally and lawfully licensed and current and active. You can be paid for things you did while you were current and active, so long as you did not do any illegal brokerage activity. Now here's the kicker, Tim. I'm saying can, because as we get into license on commission rules in North Carolina more, you will realize that the North Carolina Real Estate Commission does not care about your commissions. Except for don't you dare take one illegally. That's the only thing they care about. So Tim, what I mean is if I had an office policy that said, oh no, Tim, if you go inactive, I get to keep it all and go to Tahiti for a week. When that deal closes and you're like, give me, I'm going to say, Tim, I'm so sorry. But if you read your company policy, you're not entitled to any commission anymore. And I hope you learned a valuable lesson about keeping your license current and active. By the way, Tim, I'm going on vacation next week. I just came into $10,000. Have a good one. So you can be legally paid in the eyes of the commission, but the commission will not get involved for a policy discrepancy. Because if you sign an independent contractor agreement that says you're not entitled to anything, the firms can be more strict than the commission. They just can't be less strict. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Appreciate that.
Yeah, for sure. Excellent question. Yeah. That's cold-blooded, right? I'm just like, I'm going to Tahiti. Thanks for the vacation, Tim. Right? Ruthless. So, this is just reiterating everything I've said. Current license on inactive status can't do nothing. You paid your money, but you didn't take your education, something like that. Can't do anything. The only status that can legally and lawfully do real estate brokerage in North Carolina is current and active. Now, the last couple visuals here, we've also already mentioned because, as I've told y'all before, I don't read slides to you. I tell you what you need to know. The slides are there for you visual folks that need to have them reiterated in a visual format. So there you go. Provisional brokers and full brokers who need their CE would take gen up and want a commission approved elective for 4 hours each, totaling the 8 hours after their first renewal year. BIC and BIC and BIC eligible brokers would take 4 hours of BIC up, which satisfies their update course in 1 4-hour elective course. It's 8 hours for both. Doesn't matter which one you are, it's just 8 hours. BIC versus BIC eligible. I'm sorry. You get what I'm saying. You can read. So that's where I'm going to kind of give you a break from some of these discussions. We're going to switch gears and get into some national concepts tonight. We're going to basically pick up where the syllabus actually starts. Like I said, these are very important and testable North Carolina concepts, and I think it's good to kind of give you a foundational knowledge before we get into some of the other more national concepts. And as a reminder, I will give you versions of all these slides prior to the start of class next week. I will absolutely have those done for you. So here's just some quick little terminologies as a recap. Remember, North Carolina, we have provisional brokers. Next step up, broker, also called full broker, also called a non-provisional broker. The broker in charge is the next step up. You can be BIC eligible, means sitting at the ready, or broker in charge, which means you're actively overseeing somebody. We will talk way more about the broker in charge later. Firm is an entity with a broker's license in North Carolina. LNCL is a limited non-resident commercial license. LL Beans is the acronym to help you remember the brokerage activities, right? List, lease, buy, exchange, auction, negotiate, sell. Doing, referring to do, or offering to do, dealing with real property for others for compensation. A license would be required in North Carolina. Active versus inactive, typically due to education, unless we're dealing with provisional. It's still education, but you also start out that way, even if you're good on education, because you have to have supervision. Current versus expired is all about your renewal fees, $45 every year for every license prior to June 30th. Sole proprietorship is a business passing through a person. They've not created an entity. And an entity is anything created with the Secretary of State. A limited liability company, a partnership, a corporation are going to be the three main examples. There you go. So let's switch gears, folks. Give me a second. Let me switch your slides here. There we go. Can everybody see this very pretty picturesque picture of a house that says Basic Real Estate Concepts Unit 1? Everybody see that? Cool.
Yes.
So let me kind of give you some insight as to what we're about to get into. This is where the syllabus actually kind of starts, because a lot of the things that I was really getting into is technically part of North Carolina License Law and Commission Rulebooks section. But I find it very pertinent and practical to introduce it first and then circle back around to it more later. So what we're getting into now is basic terminology, some general considerations for the real estate industry, the business, the practices, things of that nature. And then we're going to, kind of transition out of that into some things that you need to know about real estate, terms that you may or may not have heard before, may or may not know what they mean, encroachments, encumbrances, appurtenances, fixtures, real property, personal property. So a lot of good information. And then, of course, I will do a fantastic job of trying to articulate what is North Carolina specific and what is national, so you can kind of keep it right in your heads as we go along throughout the items. So, do understand that the beginning first couple slides, okay, I'm going to explain it to you, and it lays a good foundational knowledge, but most of the things within basic real estate concepts, or at least the beginning of basic real estate concepts, they're not heavily testable. I mean, if you look at, even though I know that your test is being changed, the numbers of questions are being changed, but if you look at, basic real estate concepts as outlined in the syllabus in North Carolina, the way that it sits in the current real estate licensing in North Carolina book, you may get 1 or 0 questions on basic real estate concepts. Now, it's going to kind of go a couple different directions, and I'll tell you which ones are more testable than others. So we're going to talk about, the different things, like the terms of land versus real estate versus real property. Because when I was using that 3-tiered criteria, real property for others for compensation, I said, well, there's a nuance to what real property is versus the word real estate versus land. So a lot of different things going to come into play here. And so let me just kind of set the tone, folks. Basically, every single thing in a nutshell can be divided into 2 categories, or at least as long as we're not talking about humans. But if we're talking about things, they are generally referred to as real property versus personal property. Folks, real property is the building you are currently in, attached to the ground it is currently sitting on, as part of the land and all the rights that come with it. Okay, that is what we are dealing with. That's what this class is all about. Real estate, also called real property, also called land in some context. I'm going to give you the clarification on the rest of those differentiations. Everything else is personal property. If you look around you, right? Tim has a lamp behind him. That's personal property. Kirsten sitting in a chair. That's personal property. There's a lovely plant behind Sandeep. That's personal property. Dora owns the Golden Gate Bridge. That's personal property. No, I'm just kidding. She's got a virtual background. Do you see what I'm saying? There is this differentiation between real property and personal property. And it is very important to understand the difference. Folks, let me tell you why. You ready for this? Whether you've bought a house before or not, whether you intend to buy a house or not, one of the most important questions that every single person wants to know when they go to buy a house: what stays and what goes? Because sometimes it's obvious, right? You know when you buy somebody's house that you don't get their Mercedes that's in the garage, okay? That's obvious to us. But sometimes things aren't so obvious. So we got to make sure that we understand the difference between real property and personal property. Now we're going to have some more in-depth conversations about the difference between the two in a moment. But let's just start with some real basic things. I keep saying land versus real estate versus real property. If you were asked to differentiate between them, there is a technical difference. Now, please let me warn you of something. If you see on a test a question about, Justin buying a piece of land, they're not trying to trick you in that question. The only time we care about the difference between land versus real estate versus real property is if they ask a very specific question like, what is the difference between the legal definition of land and real estate. They would have to get very specific. Otherwise, they don't care, and you shouldn't care. They're never trying to trick you on a contract law question by saying they purchase land, real estate, or real property. It's really going to be used interchangeably on the test unless they ask you to differentiate. So let's start with land, folks. What is land?
It's land. It's a piece of earth.
It's a piece of earth. You can't use the definition in the definition, okay? Or the word in the definition. It's land. Well, all right. It sure is. Piece of earth. I'll accept that. A piece of earth. Anybody else? What's land?
Real property.
Sure, it is.
Well, you can't move it. You can't take it. Or
There you go. I'm talking about some great physical characteristics of land. Yeah, folks, we don't need to overcomplicate this, right? You could look out your window and be like, that stuff, Seth. That stuff right there, that's land. That's land. And you're right. When we say land, we mean grass, the dirt, the soil, the components, the whatever. Okay, so land from a real estate point of view, finite resources, technically it is. They are not making any more land, are they, Monica? It is finite to the umpteenth degree. That's the one thing we're not making any more of. Until we start putting a population of people on Mars, or we start building up into the sky like the Jetsons, right? If we get some floating buildings, but you're right, otherwise it's finite. So when we talk about land in this class, while we're differentiating at least, land is above and beyond the dirt and the grass, right? Because that's typically what we think of. But the definition of land is actually everything on the earth's surface and everything down to the center of the earth and everything upwards towards infinity or the heavens or whatever you want to call it. So when you own land, you actually own into the ground as well. You own above it as well. So the earth's surface, everything above and everything below. And this would include every naturally occurring thing on that land. Trees, shrubs, rivers, creeks, streams, whatever. So that's the definition of land. Now we're going to talk about rights more in a second. So don't get so caught up yet. When we say down to the center of the earth, those are called subsurface rights. When we say upwards above the land, those are called air rights. We will talk about those in a moment. So don't get squirrely with those questions yet. So when we take it a step further and we use the terminology real estate, well, that's the one that you're most familiar with. You're actually trying to become a real estate broker. Some of you own real estate. Some of you are aspiring to have a real estate portfolio. The most common terminology that everybody knows, likes, loves, and uses is real estate. From a legal textbook class point of view, the term real estate is this land definition that we just gave you, plus all attachments, whether they be man-made or natural. Fences, houses, septic tanks, sidewalks, sheds, whatever. So we call those things improvements. Anytime that you do something to the land, like add a house, that's called an improvement. If you add infrastructure, it's called an improvement. So real estate, also sometimes referred to as realty, is the land plus all attachments, both man-made and natural. Okay, that's real estate. Pausing for dramatic effect for you note takers, no worries. Not frozen or anything, I'm just sitting here. Sometimes I talk a little fast, I know. So then we've talked about land. We've talked about real estate. The other term that I keep utilizing is real property. In fact, I utilize that quite a bit in the, real property for others for compensation examples of when a license is required. I'm sorry, Sam says, you said the man-made attachments are called improvements. Yes, that's exactly it. They are called improvements. Anything you do to improve the land is called an improvement. And it could be, like I said, anything. Houses, septics, sidewalks, all those are called improvements. Improvements, yes, you could absolutely see the term improvements, Corey, on the test.
Appreciate that.
For sure. And we're going to talk about improvements a little bit more in just a moment. So the next one is the real property one, okay? Folks, real property, we just keep stacking on the previous two definitions. So now we've got the definition of real estate, plus it's said to include what we call a bundle of legal rights. In other words, the land, everything permanently attached to the land, both natural and man-made, and this concept of legal rights. Now, we're going to talk about these legal rights in just a second, but folks, what you have to understand is when you own real estate, when you own real property, you are said to have a set of rights with that property because of your ownership. And so the rights are going to be probably the more testable piece of these conversations. I would be very surprised. And I'm not going to say that we don't have them in the study materials just to make sure you understand it, but I would be very surprised if on the actual licensing exam they had a question as easy as, what's the difference between land and real estate? And then the answer is, man-made improvements, right? Like that just seems too easy of a question in my opinion. I'm not going to say it won't exist, but so we're going to talk about this bundle of legal rights more in just a second, but there's just the direct legal differentiation between land, real estate, and real property. Now, when we're talking about real property, because now that you know that word, that's basically the word I'm going to use more often than not. There are certain characteristics of real property that you have to be aware of. And so this is where under the basic real estate concepts you have to understand we're going to touch on a few different things. Even though they're not any of them crazy testable, they're all, as a smattering, could appear on the test. So we're going to talk very briefly about physical characteristics of real property. We're going to talk about economic characteristics of real property. We're going to talk about, kind of the scope of the real estate business as a whole. So a lot of smattering is the best word I got. Smattering things that we can talk about here. So when I say physical characteristics, folks, physical means a very specific set of things depending on the context. And so for real estate, it is these items that you can't argue with based on its mass, its components, its existability. And so the first physical characteristic of real estate is what we call immobility. Some of y'all mentioned this whenever I asked you what land was. Well, it can't be moved. We can all agree if you buy 20 acres in the middle of, Wake Forest, you own 20 acres in the middle of Wake Forest, and until you sell it, you will only own 20 acres in the middle of Wake Forest. It is impossible to move land. It's possible to move dirt, but not land. The next physical characteristic of real property is indestructibility. Yet again, if you're thinking about the land itself, I want you to think about this. You walk outside and you shoot the ground, nothing happens. So land in and of itself is indestructible. Yet again, don't confuse the fact that you can move dirt with the fact that, it's destructible. It's not. Because if you keep taking away dirt, there's still stuff underneath. And so the area that is your ownership of this physical piece of property doesn't change. So it is immobile. It is indestructible. And the last one is uniqueness. Understand that there are no pieces of real estate, real property, land in the entire world that are the same. There are, of course, similar ones, but because of the longitude, latitude, the features, the adjacent properties, there is no two pieces of real property that are the same. We call that, and these are sometimes testable words, non-homogeneity or heterogeneity. It's just a fancy real estate word for uniqueness. Non-homogeneity means not the same. Heterogeneity means not the same. Right? It's kind of like, and please don't, this is not like homosexual means same sex. Heterosexual meaning attracted to opposite sex. Same thing, right? You're not the same, non-homogeneity, and hetero meaning not the same. They both mean the same thing. Now, for the life of me, I don't understand why we have so many like super duper unique words that kind of come in as like vocabulary. They're like, that seems completely unnecessary. When uniqueness seemed fine. We really got to throw heterogeneity in there? That's a thing, right? That needed to be a word? Okay. I thought uniqueness was a fine word, but apparently not. So these are the physical characteristics of real property, okay? Immobility, indestructibility, and uniqueness. Well, next let's talk about the economic. Understand the difference. These all have to do with its mass and where it's located and, the fact that it can't be reproduced. Well, economics has to do with value, right? Value. And so economics is a very complex subject matter, but it all runs off of the same basic principle of supply and demand. Economics 101 dictates these supply and demand curves. And so we've got these 4 economic characteristics of real property. And the way that we help you remember these is with the acronym SLIP. S-L-I-P. SLIP. Scarcity being the first one. Folks, the less of something there is, the more valuable it is. Think about diamonds. Now, arguably, there's probably way more diamonds than they're telling us, but if there were only so many of something, it becomes automatically more valuable because it's more coveted. People are willing to pay more. Same is true of real estate. Now, of course, scarcity is true because, as Monica pointed out, land is finite, but it's actually one of the most abundant things we have. There is a whole heck of a lot of land that is not developed. But scarcity in an individual location. Folks, if you want to buy in the heart of downtown Raleigh, you got to pay a pretty penny nowadays. If you want to buy in the heart of New York, you got to pay a pretty penny nowadays because it is very scarce. There's really not much more that can be developed in certain areas. The next one is arguably one of the most important characteristics of real estate. Location, location, location. Kind of going with what I was just saying. Folks, don't think that there's not land to buy. Oh, there's plenty. You drive west and north a little ways, and there is miles and miles and miles of really cold, really boring, nothing to do dirt. And I'm sure somebody would sell it to you for a reasonable price. Location is an economic characteristic because people like to live where there's fun stuff to do, where there's great jobs, where there's easy accessibility, which is why you're going to pay more to live here versus there. Location is a huge economic characteristic of real estate or real property. Improvements, there's that word. Of course, when you improve a property, it's more valuable. Let me ask you this. If I was to say, I've got this house that has everything you need, want, and desire, and I'm willing to sell it to you, or I got this piece of dirt that you can put a 10 on, which one is worth more to you? The house, right? Because listen, camping's cool for a weekend. I don't want to do it indefinitely. You know what I'm saying? So improvements make a property more valuable. The infrastructure, the houses, the sheds, 3-car garage, all these different improvements make it more valuable from an economic point of view. Now, the last economic characteristic is permanence. And so, in theory, real property is a very permanent investment. Businesses can go under, right? And so if you had any stock options in a business that files bankruptcy and doesn't exist, then you have lost your investment. It doesn't exist anymore, at least under some circumstances. But as long as you continue to own real property, it is a very permanent investment. It doesn't go away. I will tell you, and there's a slide that's going to come up in a second that probably echoes this. One of the reasons why we're dealing with real estate as an investment, that it is a very sound investment because of this permanent piece. The problem with real estate as an investment is it lacks liquidity, meaning it cannot be turned into cash very fast. Stock options can be sold today. Houses have to be listed. You have to find somebody who's willing to buy it. It has to go through a process. It has to be deeded and recorded, and then you get money. So it is a very permanent investment. It is typically a very sound investment, not a very liquid investment. If you need cash tomorrow, and with the exception of maybe some home equity lines, but those still require a process, not a very liquid investment. Now let me throw some other vocabulary into the mix here while we're talking about some different things. You will see a word called situs. Yet again, crazy word that really comes into play in real estate that you probably never heard before. And so you can really think of the word situs as desirable area or area preference, where you prefer to be. That's really what it comes down to. So if it's more desirable, for you to be in Raleigh, that is your situs, your desired area. That's all it means. Area preference. And that's what makes land more valuable in certain areas. This is what I told you. If I told you that you could buy a house where it's negative 500 degrees and there's nothing to do there and nobody to talk to for miles and there's no internet, or you could buy this beautiful house in the middle of your most desired area and it's got all the features and there's shopping and restaurants and everything nearby, depending on which one you prefer, that would be your area preference, right? Situs, preferred area over another, making it more valuable to you. Now, another thing that comes into play here, now understand that we're going to talk about these concepts more later. This is yet again another instance of me introducing the basic concept of economic and physical characteristics, but when we get into like real property valuation section, we'll talk about these some more. And so let me throw this one into the mix. There is what we call a concept of highest and best use with real estate. And it is this premise that a property has only one highest and best use at any given time, and it is where the property would realize the maximum return on its investment, where you would maximize the value. Understand that this can change. And so let me give you an example of this. Folks, if you went to Florida back in 1950 and you look where Disney World is now, it was marshlands, it was farmlands, it was a whole lot of nothing. And I'm sure the highest and best use at that time was probably the farmland. But when Walt Disney bought it and turned it into this multi-billion-dollar amusement park, he changed the highest and best use. There is nothing you can put where Disney World is that would make any more money than it currently makes. I'll give you another example of this. At RDU, International Airport, up near Raleigh-Durham, there used to be a motel. And it was there for a very long time. And they decided that the hotel was not really making any money and it really wasn't a big use for it anymore. So they leveled it and they turned it into the parking garages that are there now. They decided that that was now the highest and best use of that piece of real estate. Please understand that not every property is being utilized for its highest and best use. And arguably, you could say that most probably aren't. There are real estate companies or, analytic companies that could evaluate a property's highest and best use. But that's all it is. Just this concept of it maximizing its value at the moment. Oh, I was just pausing for dramatic effect to send you on break. Go take a break. Come back at 7:25. So, let's keep going with some of these discussions about real estate, real property, land, whatever you'd like to call it. Of course, depending on the context, but in this moment, it's fine to call it whatever. I want to explain something to you folks, and this is going to help you understand a lot of the future things that we're going to get into. If you own land right now, can you do whatever you want with it? A couple of you.
Adult diapers.
Adult diapers. Depends. A lot of you shaking your heads, right? You're saying no. Somebody tell me why not.
My HOA.
Your HOA, specifically your HOA says there's certain things you can and can't do, right? It's a good answer. That's one reason.
Your city.
Your city. Folks, y'all are so smart. Understand that we're going to talk about a lot of different land ownership concepts. And so as we get into a deeper dive, it is very important to understand that there is always going to be what we call some type of public or private land use controls. Well, Sandeep said city. So let's group that and do public land use controls. Public land use controls are the government saying what you can and can't do with your land. Your counties, your cities, your municipalities, things of this nature. Then there is the other side, which Dora pointed out, which is her HOA. Well, that is what we call private land use controls. People who are private land owners have the ability to set restrictions on their own land. And those restrictions sometimes continue on to future users. And so private versus public are very important to understand. Now, I'm not teaching these to you now. We talk about these in later sections. But understand that when we're having these discussions, no matter how great your land ownership is, right? Let's say that you own your land, your house, your whatever, and it's paid off, right? Like, I own it outright. That's great. But there are still people who have potentially restricted your use of it. Public and private land use controls are a very important, very testable concept that we'll get into later. So let's talk about real estate as an investment. I told you it was going to come up. There are several benefits to holding real estate as an investment. There are tax benefits through depreciation, use, and otherwise. They typically maintain a really reasonable or high rate of return. And most values keep pace with inflation. Houses have climbed and climbed and climbed and climbed and climbed. And if you own property, the values of those have a tendency to climb and climb and climb and climb and climb. So they are one of the most on pace, if not sometimes ahead of, inflation items. Generally speaking, of course, this is just a generalization, not a one-size-fits-all. There's no guarantee that just because you bought a piece of real estate that you're going to have a huge rate of return or anything like that, because there are bad investments in real estate. Then, of course, the main disadvantage of real estate as an investment is, as I mentioned earlier, it lacks liquidity. It takes some time to turn it into cash. So here's where I'm going to kind of shift into some of the more broad discussions in this basic real estate concept section. When we're dealing with real estate, yet again, we keep using the word real estate or real property, there are different categories of real estate. We can all agree that there is houses, there is hotels, there's amusement parks, there's hospitals, there is mining, there's a lot of different uses of real estate. And so we can generally break them into a few main groupings of categories. Residential is where people intend to live. Now, important to note that, of course, you can have a commercial property that's used as residential, and you can have what's called a residential transaction. So a commercial property would be a 700-unit apartment complex. The individual apartments are residential, but of course that is a commercial building intended for residential. Residential, by definition in North Carolina, purchase-wise anyway, is 1 to 4 units. If you were helping somebody purchase one specific unit or a duplex, triplex, up to a quadruplex, we consider that residential. Now that's going to it's going to matter more as a distinction when we get into certain things like a North Carolina law called the Residential Property Disclosure Act, which applies to 1 to 4 unit dwellings. Anything more than 4 units would not be applicable to that act. So when I say commercial, it's a very kind of broad categorization. There's a lot of different types of commercial. We could have commercial retail. We could have office space. We could have, industrial commercial. And so sometimes commercial is and industrial grouped together. But industrial, of course, can have its own category. Agricultural, farming, raising livestock otherwise. And then special purpose. I've already used Disney World as an example in here, but Disney World would be special purpose, golf course, hospital. Things that don't necessarily have a home in the other places could be special purpose. And of course, the other understanding that you have to have is this also changes state by state. When I talk about zoning, like their categorizations of zoning for those public land use controls, it changes depending on your city, your state, your municipality. There's no one size fits all. Now, aside from the categories of real estate that we could kind of classify the individual real estate or real property into, there is the discussion we need to have about real estate from a job force, from an industry as a whole, not just these categories. But when I say real estate, folks, or the business of real estate, it is you ready for this? Multi-trillion dollar industry. Multi-trillion dollar industry. That's a big number. And so you all are endeavoring in one very specific facet of the real estate industry as a whole, brokerage. And we've already used this term broker. Broker is somebody who brings together two parties in a transaction. Somebody wants to buy, somebody wants to sell. Lessor or lessee. And so for us specifically, just so you know, annotate writes on my screen, not just your screen. So I'm going to...
Yeah, sorry about that.
It's okay. There's always one in every class, Manoj, who starts writing on my screen. As long as you don't start drawing anything inappropriate up there, we'll be okay. So, no big deal. So you folks are endeavoring into real estate brokerage, helping people buy and sell, lessor and lessee, managing properties, all these different facets of things that we do. But folks, there's way more than just that, okay? Appraisers who determine values for banks or homeowners. Investors, people who buy and sell real estate, who have long-term holdings, who, there's about 10 billion different ways that you can invest. Wholesaling, long-term property holdings, pay down of depreciation of assets, for tax purposes. There's a lot of different facets of investing. Surveyors are people who go out and survey lots. And so they have specialized training to figure out the area that makes up the border of a piece of real property. Engineers are typically used for both planning of subdivisions. We have what we call civil engineers and civil surveyors. And so they could outline things like infrastructure, what we would need for a waste disposal system, what the roads would look like, what type of housing would be acceptable, redrawing plans. So there's real estate engineers. There's property management, where we manage properties on behalf of the investors sometimes if they've got these holdings where, they are tenants and there are things that need to be done. And so that is, property management is a facet within brokerage for North Carolina. And of course, from a national point of view, you could potentially differentiate them, but it's the same license in North Carolina. Financing is a very big piece of this. Folks, the vast majority of people do not have the cash in their wallet right now to go out and buy a $700,000 house in cash. So the way that we remedy that is we borrow money. And so there is initial loans. There's the secondary mortgage market. There is refinancing. There is cash out refis. There is, there's a lot of different pieces of the financing world. Property development, meaning going out and buying land and turning it into infrastructure, high rises, single family detached subdivisions, any number of different types of property. There is coaching. Some people get into real estate and then they just end up coaching other people how to do it. Of course, there's what I do. I teach people real estate. Now I do sales as well. And we could go on and on and on. Now, do understand that while this is something that is heavily outlined in the first couple of chapters of your book, this is in the really trivial, not as crazy testable section. So when you start taking like quiz 1 and quiz 2, you're going to see some questions about businesses or, specializations in real estate. Some of that stuff could be answered with common sense. If you just really sit there and think about it. If you know what a property manager is, and they say something like, well, what's the primary, goal of a property manager? Well, to maintain properties and the investment for somebody else. Okay, that'd be a property manager. What's the, main goal of, a portfolio manager? To, sell a whole investment portfolio in one fell swoop. There's some nuances to it, but folks, it's not extremely testable. So I would say that, as you go through your textbook, unless you've already read, chapters 1 and 2 in their complete and utter entirety, when it gets to the specialization, skim it, read it, be aware of the different facets of the real estate business, but don't kill yourself there. There's not going to be a whole lot of questions on that. Okay, they're going to be general questions, not super specific, not heavily, not level 3. Let's say that they're not level 3 concepts. They're level 1. Know that this is a thing. So I already talked about the economics piece, and so there's nothing too crazy because we will talk about valuations later, but of course the real estate market it's very cyclical, we'll say that. If you actually were to punch in your computer right now, real estate market cycle, there is a rise, a fall, a leveling out, a rise, a fall, a leveling out, a rise, a fall, and it's very consistently done things like that. Of course, you've got some anomalies on that chart in the 08 and 09, and you've got new anomalies if you have a chart that's most up to date in 2021 and 2022, where the market changed drastically. But over time, it's very cyclical. But of course, we are affected by a lot of different things. The economy as a whole, inflation, jobs, the pricing market index, and then of course, supply and demand as it comes into it. In a given area where you've got, 6 billion residents and only, 1 million houses, they're going to be very expensive because of that supply and demand. The less of something there is, the more demand there is for it, the more it costs. And so that is when I keep saying supply and demand curves, this is what it looks like. This is what we call the equilibrium price, where the demand and the supply have this sweet spot. But as the supply goes up, the demand goes down. As the supply goes down, the demand goes up. Okay, vice versa. Real estate fits that mold. Now, remember, land is finite, as we said before, but it's not necessarily scarce. It's just scarce in locales. It's scarce in downtown Raleigh. It's scarce in downtown, Wilmington. It's scarce in, wherever your favorite place is. It's not scarce in general. And so just another kind of flow of real estate. This is all generalization stuff. And the really key investment pieces we'll get into a little bit more down the road. So I think that's really enough for the real estate basics section. I think we've hit enough of these basics that, we kind of talked about, some verbiage, some things to be aware of, maybe delve into them a little bit more in your studies. And of course, I'll always circle back around, but it's not a crazy testable section. One-ish question on the national test, one-ish question on the state level test in regard to basic real estate concepts, if you will. If you look at the current Relink book, it's 2 and 1, but because it was 4 groupings of categories, which is why I told you 1 and 1. So here's just some real quick reminder of verbiage that we talked about here. Land is Earth's surface down to the center, everything above the land. Real estate is land plus any improvements, whether or attachments, things attached, right? Both man-made and natural. Real property is all that and a bag of potato chip. No, I'm kidding. Real property is all that plus this bundle of legal rights, which we're going to get into in just a moment. Situs is a fancy word for area preference or desirability of an area. Chattel, we're going to talk about more down the road. And so sometimes, I mentioned it in the first chapter, sometimes I don't. So hang tight. I'm not going to tell you about that one yet. And then economic versus physical characteristics, right? Economic was our SLIP acronym. Physical was our immobility, indestructibility, and permanence. So, y'all ready for some doozy concepts? Here's where things get funky. Kirsten says, bring it on. The rest of y'all shaking your Monica said yes. Misty said yes. Yeah. There you go. I'm very enthusiastic. I'm here for it. So here's where we're going to get into your first, what I will call doozy section. Okay? Yeah, some of the things I've introduced for license on commission rules were a lot, but of course that wasn't the only time you're going to hear it. These next concepts, it's kind of the only time you're going to hear it unless I just say it in passing for, some of the other things. So what we're getting into now is talking about property ownerships and interest. different ways that people can own property, different ways people can ultimately, we'll get to where we can, ways that you can convey property, some terminology that you need to be aware of within these concepts, and everything in between. So this is the first place where people kind of get a little bit of a stink face, right? It's like somebody farted in a crowded elevator. That's what you're going to look like. You're going to be like, I'm sorry, I have to teach this to you. All right? So here's the focus of this section, all right? We're going to talk about what an estate is. We're going to talk about these types of ownership, right? Concurrent ownership, hybrid ownership, ownership in severalty. Going to talk about liens, going to introduce some new words like I mentioned earlier, appurtenances, encumbrances, easements, rights, subsurface and otherwise. Lot of good stuff in this chapter. And so I'll say this. This is all extremely testable. But there's not a crazy amount of questions if you look at the current Relink book and the way that it's categorized, right? For, ownership basics and estates and interest, I think there's like 4 questions as it currently sits. Now, of course, we all know that the way they're going to allocate the questions are a little bit different, and we won't know that until next week, I believe. So, but it is very testable. Just not a crazy amount of questions. We'll say it that way. So earlier, when I was talking about real property, that's the term we're going to use more often than not throughout this class. And I told you that real property was real estate plus this bundle of legal rights. So land, all attachments, natural and man-made, and this bundle of legal rights. Well, let's talk about this bundle of legal rights first, okay? I said that when you own real estate, yeah, you own it, that's great. You have a house, you have a piece of dirt, you have whatever it is that you own, but you have more than that. You have this concept of legal rights where we say that, okay, as the owner, you have the right to do certain things or not do certain things, as it were. And so there's an acronym for this too to help you memorize these. And the acronym is Deep C. Except instead of the ocean, it's the letter C. Okay? Deep sea. And so you have, under these real property, bundle of legal rights, the right of disposition, the right of exclusion, the right of enjoyment, the right of possession, and the right of control. Now, I'm going to start explaining them to you while you take notes on this slide, as a lot of you are, but then there are individual slides for each one of these letters. Folks, think about the root word of disposition. It's to dispose of. After you're done with a piece of garbage, you dispose of it and you get rid of it. You have the right to dispose of your property. Now, of course, you can't crumple it up into a ball and yell Kobe when you throw it somewhere, but you do have the right to sell it, give it away, gift it. That is what we call the right of disposition. When you own it, you have the right to give it to somebody else. Okay, right of disposition. Well, start with the next E, the first E, you also have the right of exclusion. You ever seen a no trespassing sign? Yeah, those work because of this right here. The right to keep others off your property. It is your property. You do not have to allow other people onto it. All you have to do is notify them that they're not welcome, and they're not. And if you don't believe me, be aware that North Carolina has something called the Castle Doctrine. If you go into somebody's property without asking, you will leave with extra holes. Just being honest. So the right of exclusion, which is the right to keep other people out. The right of enjoyment. Now, folks, this one is kind of a tricky real estate terminology. This is one that's a little different than what it sounds like. It's not just like, oh yeah, this is nice. I'm really enjoying being in my house right now. Okay, that's not what we mean. I'm sure you do enjoy sitting on your couch in your snuggly jammies, drinking wine and watching Netflix. Okay, we all do. But that's not the type of enjoyment I'm talking about. Enjoyment without others interrupting your enjoyment, okay? So if you own it, nobody else is coming forward saying that they own it. That is what we call the right of enjoyment. If you're leasing it, nobody has the right to come in and remove you while you are leasing it. It is the right to utilize whatever relationship you have to the property without somebody interfering. Okay, that's what that means, right of enjoyment. Sometimes referred to as quiet enjoyment, that we'll talk about more later. Now, the right of possession, yet again, it's not exactly what it sounds like, okay? It is not the charge that Snoop Dogg would get if he was pulled over by the cops right now, okay? That's not the kind of possession we're talking about. Possession is occupying the property. Being in it. Living in it. Okay, that's the right of possession. Don't overcomplicate it. And then the last one is the right of control. And so this basically translates to, well, the right to determine the use of the land within the scope of the law and private land use controls. And so the other ways we articulate this is use of the control or control of the property and its profits is what we'll say. Like, in other words, as long as it's not illegal, if you wanted to grow a crop and sell it, you could. If you wanted to, rent it out to somebody, you could. If you wanted to, demolish it and do something that, different with it, you could. Now, let me explain something to you. These rights are for when you own a piece of property. Okay, you own a piece of real property and then you're said to own these rights. Well, here's the interesting thing. These are what we would call severable. You can remove these rights from yourself. So, let me ask you a question. If you are renting a house right now, or an apartment, doesn't matter, townhouse, apartment, house, do you own it? Let me rephrase this, because sometimes people get confused on what I mean by own, okay? Could you sell it?
You're in possession of it.
There you go. Folks, you do not own it. If you are renting, you do not own it. Ownership means that you could turn around and sell it to somebody else. So Josh said it perfectly. Folks, was that Josh? Was that you that said that?
Yeah, that was me.
Okay. Folks, when you are a tenant, let me explain this to you. You have purchased, albeit temporarily, the right of possession, the right of exclusion, and the right of enjoyment from the owner. They have severed these three rights from themselves and given them to you. Because, folks, let's say that you're renting a house from me. I can't just barge through your front door one morning and be like, sorry, I'm out of milk, I need to borrow some, and just fill up a cup and just walk back out. I can't do that. Even though I own the place, I'm not allowed to do that. You know why? Because I have given the right of exclusion to you. You don't have to let me in. Now, don't get caught up on that. Legally, I can put it in a lease that you do have to let me in under certain circumstances, so don't get too excited. But you do have the right of exclusion. Well, if you sign a 1-year lease, nobody else can come and interfere with your 1-year lease as long as you follow the rules. So you have the right of quiet enjoyment for your 1-year lease. And you are currently occupying the property, so you have the right of possession. But you, as a tenant, you do not have the right of disposition. You can't sell it. That is left with the owner. And sometimes you may or may not have the right of control. Because if you wanted to turn around and sublet it out, there's probably rules in place that say you can't do that. If you wanted to rip out my begonias and put in rose bushes instead, I'd probably have something written that says you can't do that. If you wanted to demolish it and build something, you definitely can't do that. So you may or may not have the right of control. Do you understand what's happening here? When you are an owner, you were said to have this full bundle of legal rights. But as the owner of the property, you could sever these rights and give them to other people. So you absolutely have rights as a tenant, right? As a renter. But you're not the owner. Does it make sense for everybody? So when you own real property, you own this bundle of legal rights, and these can be severed, and then they can be given back. They can be broken off. And so here's just the slightly longer version of everything that I just said, okay? Right of disposition, the right to dispose of it or sell to somebody else. So only an owner can have this right. Tenant cannot. Manoj, did you have a question?
No.
Okay.
I'm good.
No worries. So right of disposition is the right to sell it, gift it, will it, dispose of it, something like that. Right of exclusion, no trespassing. Stay out. It's mine. Keep out, Girl Scout. It doesn't have to be yours, but you can, like I said, prevent other people from coming onto your property. Could be held by an owner, could be held by a tenant if we rented it out. Right of enjoyment. Okay, that said that's where nobody can impede upon whatever rights you currently have, whether that be your ownership rights or your tenancy rights. If you've got a year left, you have to be given your year as long as you follow the rules. If you own it, nobody else can come and claim ownership. So that is the right of enjoyment. So technically, either a tenant or a owner could hold this right depending. Right of possession, could be a tenant, could be an owner. It's just occupying, okay? The right to occupy. If you buy a house, you own the house, you live in the house, you are utilizing your right to occupy it or your right of possession. If you buy a house, you rent out a house and a tenant moves in, you have sold off, albeit temporarily, your right of possession to the tenant, the renter. And then the right of control of the property and its profits. In theory, could be held by either. More often, only held by the owner because we don't typically give full control to a tenant on what to do with the property. They typically have to come and ask permission to do certain things. So when we're dealing with real estate or real property and we're selling it off to somebody else, what we are typically doing is we are giving them the real estate, the real property, and this bundle of legal rights. So if I own 123 Main Street and I have my full set of legal rights and Eliza comes in and purchases that property, she now has the property ownership and this full set of legal rights. These convey from owner to owner, so long as they have not been severed to an extent that they cannot be transferred anymore. So I want to talk about transferring ownership for a second, folks. There is a whole section dedicated to this in a little bit. So I'm not going to get into too much detail yet. But when we transfer ownership to real estate, or real property, it's kind of a unique concept. And let me just help you out here. If you were to sell your car today, your car has a document called a title. And that title is a basically physical document that states that you own your car. And so when you sell that car to somebody else, you would sign that title over to the next person. So for a piece of personal property like a car, a title is a document. Well, when we're talking about real estate, we do talk about title, but title is a concept. In real estate, it is a concept of ownership. If I said you hold title to 123 Main Street, that means you are believed to be the owner for 123 Main Street. There's no document called a title in real estate. So the way that we indicate that title has transferred, this concept of ownership has transferred, is by way of a deed. A deed is the document showing that the rights have been transferred from one person to another. It's not the document that outright shows ownership. Title is what indicates ownership. The deed just shows transfer of ownership. There is no such thing as a title. There's a concept of title. The document that shows that transfer is a deed. Now this leads into another very important and testable concept. If, and I keep using myself as an example, let me get the pen out here. If I own 123 Main Street, by the way, folks, 123 Main Street is the most popular address in the world because I use it for every examples, because I'm just that creative. You're welcome. If I own 123 Main Street, there is a deed somewhere that exists that shows where title was transferred from the previous owner to me. And so if Misty buys this property from me, I can't give her a title because title is this concept of ownership transfer. It's not a thing, it's a concept. What I would do to show that ownership transfer is we would have a new deed that showed that I transferred it to her. So from me to Misty, which introduces a very important set of terminology. We do not say seller and buyer on a deed. What we do say is grantor and grantee, because I granted her ownership and she received the ownership. So if you looked on that deed, I would be named as the grantor and she would be named as the grantee. Now, we have a lot of or and e words in this class. A lot. And so I want you to always think of the or as the give or, and the e as the receive e. Okay, the or is the give or, the e is the receive e. And I promise we're going to talk way more about this in the very near future. But let me show you an example of these or and e words. Oops, let's stick on my pen up. Here you go. Right here on the second one, we've got our grantor and grantee that I just mentioned. We've got divisor, divisee. We got lessor, lessee. We got mortgagor, mortgagee. Offeror, offeree, optionor, optionee, trustor, trustee. A lot of or and e words. Now, folks, remember when I told you on day one that there is a lot of misnomers that people get incorrect. And one of the biggest ones that I gave you as an example already was a mortgage. And so I told you a mortgage, people misclassify as the loan. And so when I typically ask people who they think the mortgagor and who they think the mortgagee is, they get it wrong. They think the bank is the mortgagor. But it's not. Because the bank gives you money. You give the bank a mortgage. So the borrower is the mortgagor. Because the mortgage is that security instrument that pledges your home as collateral for the debt. And so it is very important to get these questions right. You know why? Because they're sick and twisted, and they're not going to use the terms that you like to hear. They're going to say that the mortgagor did this, and this, and you've got to know that the mortgagor is the borrower. Or then they might say something like, the mortgagee did this, and this, and you got to know that the mortgagee is the bank. Now, just to give you a quick rundown of these, some of these are way more testable than others, like mortgagor, mortgagee, grantor, grantee, lessor, lessee. But you could see some of these other ones, offeror, offeree. It's kind of like the middle four are the most testable. Divisor, divisee. Folks, a devise is when somebody leaves you real property by way of a will. Your great-grandpa dies and he left you a house. Okay, well, your great-grandpa's the divisor, you are the devisee. He's the one who left you real property by way of a will. You're the one that received it by way of a will. Grantor versus grantee is what I'm telling you on a deed. Okay, the person who is transferring the ownership and the person who's receiving it is the grantee. Lessor, lessee. I want you to think about this. Based on what I've told you, folks, if we're talking about a landlord-tenant relationship, who is the lessor and who is the lessee?
The lessor would be the tenant.
Well, what's being given here?
No, that's wrong.
The leasee would be the tenant.
The lessee would be the tenant because the lessor is the person who gives you the lease. And so that would be the property owner, okay? The property owner is the lessor, the landlord is the lessor, the tenant is the lessee. Because the tenant receives the lease, which is the right to occupy. The lessor gives the lease. Remember we said mortgagor, mortgagee. Mortgagor is the borrower. The other way to remember that is the mortgagee is never me. Okay, we got these fun little quirky things, okay? And we're going to talk way more about that in the financing section. Now, here's the deal. This other one is very important, all right? So offeror and offeree. Offeror is the person who gives the offer. Offeree is the person who receives the offer. So folks, who is the offeror?
The person buying the house or putting in the offer on the house, I guess.
The person putting in the offer on the house. You ready for this? That's a trick question. I know, I'm mean and cruel and hateful like that. Folks, understand that typically the buyer is the person putting the offer on the house. And so more often than not, the buyer is the offeror, the seller is the offeree. But legally, there is nothing stopping me as a seller from going to you, Kirsten, and saying, I'll sell you my house for $400,000. I just made you an offer, so I am the offeror, you are the offeree. And this is why you can't think so, well, I don't know the word that I'm looking for, but you can't just look at things as black and white. Because if you always think of a buyer as an offeror, you'll get the question wrong. That's why we use these terms, because it is dependent on the scenario. Buyer could be an offeror or an offeree. Seller could be an offeror or an offeree. Let me tell you why else. If I'm the buyer and Kirsten, you're selling your house and I send you an offer, you're right. As the buyer, I am the offeror. As the seller, Kirsten, you are the offeree. I'm sorry, the offeree. But watch what happens. I'm sorry, I was like reading. Monica, you can't confuse me with big words like that when I'm trying to give a lecture here. I like looked over at that word. I'm like, oh my God, my brain. No, that's good. What happens, Kirsten, when I say, well, hey, I'd like to buy your house for $500,000. I'm the offeror, you're the offeree. But then when you say, 505, you just made me a counter offer. Now you're the offeror, I'm the offeree. So it is that word that Monica said, right? That's, so we'll get more into this down the road. Optionor, optionee. Optionor is the person who gives an option. Optionee is the person who receives the option. We're going to talk about that in the contract section. That's what we call exotic contracts. Oof. We'll talk about that later. And then trustor and trustee, the person who has established the trust is the trustor. The person who oversees the trust is the trustee. Now, in a trust, there's actually a third party called a beneficiary, which is the person who receives the benefit of the trust. This is not the only time you will see these verbiages, but this is just a very important... Ow, God. Something just like pinched a nerve in my back or something. It just like freaked me out. Probably from sitting in the car for 48 hours, you know? Sorry. Okay, this is not the only time you will see this. It will come back multiple times, okay? I just needed you to kind of understand this basic insight or introduction to it. Everybody okay with everything I just told you about this right here? Okay. So we're going to get into some conversations about ownership and transfer of ownership very soon. And I told you that's where we get into the first set of section, okay? But I want to go ahead and make another very important statement here. When we're dealing with a real estate class, we will have detailed conversations on deeds and we will have detailed conversations on contracts. And there is a lot of very similar pieces of verbiage that is utilized in the conversations of deeds and contracts. But I put these two different apples to show you that they are not the same, okay? They may sound similar, they may look similar, but they're not the same. And it's very important to keep that straight. A deed is something that transfers ownership or shows the transfer of ownership. Okay, the document that shows that transfer of title. A contract is an agreement between parties that in the real estate world typically leads up to a deed transference. So we're going to have conversations at both. Deeds will be where we start and dive in deeper. And then we will, of course, circle back around, and then we'll talk about contracts later. But you've just got to make sure that you understand. And I will do a very good job of telling you, we are talking about deeds right now. Don't bring contracts into this. We are talking about contracts right now. Don't bring deeds into this. Because they have very similar verbiages. So now that I've kind of given you some insight into, deeds and terminology we'll use, let's circle back around to some of the important things that you need to understand before we talk about transferring real estate. Let me introduce a very powerful vocabulary word. It's called an appurtenance. An appurtenance. And when I say the word appurtenance, I want you to think of something that runs with the land. That is what you need to think of when you hear the word appurtenance. Something that runs with the land, meaning if I give ownership to you, you get all the appurtenances with it. And so understand, improvements are an appurtenance. If I built a house on the land and I transfer the land to you, you're getting the house too. That's an appurtenance. The bundle of legal rights. If they don't stay with me, they go to you, that's an appurtenance. Any public or private land use controls on the property go to you now. That's an appurtenance. So there's a lot of different appurtenances. Now, folks, understand that there are good appurtenances and there are bad appurtenances. The word appurtenance does not mean either or. It just means something that runs with the land. Mineral rights, subsurface rights, gas rights, good things, bad things, all the things that run with the land, that's an appurtenance. So let's take this a step further. If it is a bad thing, let's circle back around to Dora. Dora, your HOA is mean to you and they won't let you do certain things. What won't they let you do, Dora? Tell me how mean they were to you.
They won't let me put a different fence than what everybody else has. To be unique.
Okay, I like it. So let's stop there, okay? So Dora wants to put a different fence than what everybody else has, and they won't let her because they're mean and nasty people, and she wants to be unique. Now, folks, let's say that Dora turns around and tomorrow she sells her house to Josh. So Josh now owns Dora's house. Josh, are you allowed to put a different fence than what all the other neighbors have?
No.
No. So understand that Dora's property has this mean old nasty restriction on it. But when Dora moves away and buys a different property that allows her to have a different fence, she's not burdened by that anymore. Who is the new owner? Because that ran with the land. Does that make sense for everybody? So an appurtenance is something that runs with the land. If you own it, it's your problem. If somebody else owns it, it's their problem or it's their benefit. Now, a friend of mine, a fellow instructor, used to use this saying, the fleas come with the dog. I like that saying, but I felt like the problem was fleas are always bad. Appurtenances are sometimes good. But the thing is, you can't have the dog without the good and the bad. The same is true of the property. If you want the property, you're taking the good and the bad. So let's take this a step further. Notice this last piece, by the way. It says these are forever in most cases. You'll see what that means more in just a moment. If we're talking about something that restricts the ability to do something that's as powerful as like a public or private land use control, it may never go away. Sometimes it can, but sometimes it won't. So here's an example, okay? All the attached buildings are considered appurtenances or appurtenant to the property. Any rights to access water, gas, mineral, or other resources, unless severed, they would be appurtenant to the property. Leases are potentially appurtenant to the property. If I own an investment property and there's a 6-year lease on it, if I sell it to Tim, Tim is now bound by it. Restrictive covenants are appurtenant. If I have restrictive covenants that say I can't have chickens, I sell my house to Justin, Justin can't have chickens. Okay? And so understand though, they can be good, they can be bad, they can be ugly. Now folks, I just said that I can't have chickens, okay? That's kind of like Dora not being able to have a fence. Are there probably people out there who would be devastated knowing that the property that they were wanting to buy would not allow them to have chickens? Oh yeah,
Yes.
yeah. Stephanie, are you one of them? You got chickens?
Yes, I have chickens,
Yeah.
goats, dogs.
There you go. As excited as you were to answer that, she's like, I would rue the day that somebody told me I could not have my chickens. Seth, you just let them try.
I will never live in a subdivision with an HOA ever.
There you go. So Stephanie is a people who does not like the HOA. Now, folks, are there some of us who are probably happy our neighbors can't have chickens?
Yes, I'm sure there are.
You see that? So it's not necessarily a good or bad thing, but it runs with the land regardless. Now I'm going to go ahead and introduce another equally important word, and we're going to talk more about this word in a second. But now's a good time to talk about it. The word is encumbrance. An encumbrance. So an encumbrance is some type of limitation on the property. An encumbrance is some type of limitation on the property.
Can you do me the solid of spelling that?
Oh yeah, for sure. There you go. Encumbrance. So can we all agree that if you can't have chickens at a property, whether you like it, you don't like it, or otherwise, does it or does it not limit the property, limit the use of the property? So it would be an encumbrance if the restrictive covenant say you couldn't have chickens, and that encumbrance is also an appurtenance. Does that make sense? It is something limiting the use, and whoever owns it is limited by that use. It would run with the land, not the person. Okay? Now, not all encumbrances are appurtenances. What you got, Dora?
That was my question. Because I would, in that example you gave, encumbrance, it would only be if my main goal would be to have chickens, but if it's not, then it...
Well, the chickens thing, regardless of whether that's your goal or not, it's still considered an encumbrance, because whether you intended to have chickens or not, it has been limited. The use of the property has been limited.
Because it's limited.
Yeah, yeah. Even though it's not messing up you per se, the use of the property has been limited. Now, we're going to get into a more detailed thing in general, but let me just explain something, folks. There are different types of encumbrances. What I just referenced with, like, you can't have chickens, that's what we call a physical encumbrance, okay? You are limited in your use of the property, but there's also what we call financial encumbrances that we'll get to in a minute. Well, when you borrow money to buy a house, there is a lien put against your property that says if you don't pay, they're coming after your property. Everybody hopefully understands at least that basic concept before we get into the more detailed version. And so those liens on the property are considered a financial encumbrance. And in theory, those liens on the property could be considered an appurtenance. In other words, if you don't pay off your loan and I take possession of the property, that lien and the right to go after the property still exist. Now, folks, here's the $1 million question. Do you want anybody's house where the banks have a right to go after it and take it? No.
Potentially. I mean, right, if you think of it as if, say, it was a home that was inheritance, that would be an encumbrance of it not being fully paid off, but it's still partially paid off. And so as long as you continue paying the mortgage, they're not going to come after it, but you get it for essentially a discounted price.
Well, and so I never said that you were getting a discount. I didn't say they were gifting it to you. You're going to buy it from them. Do you want to buy it from them and their bank still being able to come after your house?
Well, then no.
Well, then no. So, yes. So Sam says, Oxford Dictionary says encumbrance is burden, or impediment. Is encumbrance always a burden? Yes. An encumbrance is always some way, shape, or form a limitation or burden. But an appurtenance is not. So let's talk about the lien for a second, folks. This is where you have to understand the differentiation between an appurtenance and an encumbrance. The fact that the banks can go after the house, that's an encumbrance. It's called a financial encumbrance. It's a lien. Don't worry, I'm gonna teach you that lesson in a second. But it is not always an appurtenance, because what typically happens when people sell property is they pay off their mortgage, that's the misnomer, but I'm gonna use it. They pay off their loan, and then that lien is removed. And so that's why I'm saying not all encumbrances are appurtenances. Some are removed before the property is transferred. Some cannot be removed. And I'm going to get into a lot more details. So appurtenances means something that runs with the land. Encumbrances mean some type of limitation. A lot of encumbrances are appurtenances, but not all of them are. Just let that sink in, digest for a second. Okay, what you got, Sandeep?
So my question is, can you close the property with the lien on the property?
You can.
Did you say you can?
You can. Let me give you a scenario here, Sandeep. Let's imagine that you and I are stupid, and I own a house, and there's a bank that has a lien on my house that says they can come after it if I don't pay them. And so we don't decide to do a standard transaction with real estate brokers and an attorney. Instead, we just meet up one day, Sandeep, and you and I exchange money and draft up a deed and record it at the Register of Deeds office. Well, I gave you money and you gave me ownership to the house, or however I articulated it. And then we record the deed, but nobody ever paid the bank their money. And whoever was responsible for paying it stops paying it. That lien is still on there. And they still have the right to go after that house. Because we were stupid and we didn't resolve this before we transferred ownership.
So that's on the buyer.
Well, I'm not really sure who it's on. We're going to talk about a lot of different scenarios down the road as to why that won't typically happen. But it is possible for ownership to transfer in some cases with a lien still on the property.
Got it.
Yep.
Thank you.
Yep. So before I get into the encumbrances and some of the other things a little bit more, let's just give you some examples, have some conversations about these appurtenances, okay? An appurtenance is just something that runs with the land. Improvements, rights, otherwise, are all appurtenances. The most common types of appurtenances that we're going to refer to in this class, we're going to talk about that are going to be testable right here. Fixtures, water rights, air rights, subsurface rights, and restrictions placed on a deed. Now, there's more than that, but these are some of the big categories to help you understand these as we get going here. Sandeep, is your hand just up from before?
Yes, it was.
No worries. No big deal. So let's start with one of the more involved discussions, okay? Water rights. Folks, we love real estate with bodies of water, don't we? Oh, living next to the beach is so nice. Oh, look at that beautiful river view. Oh, having a fishing pond is so great. Okay, we love bodies of water near our real estate. Not for insurance purposes, but for, enjoyability purposes. And so when you own real estate that deals with water, there are a couple of different considerations in how these water rights or rights to use the water are handled. Okay. Now, of course, this conversation only matters if there is adjacent water or, water on the property. If there's not, then this is a moot point. And so we break this into two main categories. Technically, there's a third. Okay. So if you look down at the bottom of my screen, we've got riparian rights, littoral rights, and doctrine of prior appropriation. Now, folks, littoral is not the same as literal, okay? We're not literally talking about water. It's littoral. And the way that we categorize these, or we differentiate these, is the types of bodies of water. So the easiest way to think about it, folks, is, and I'll provide one caveat, and you just got to be very careful on the test because some national testing providers are stupid. But the easiest way to think about this is littoral really more often than anything is the ocean. And riparian is everything else. Now, there's a little bit more to it than that, but that's a generalization. What you got, Misty? I can see the panic on your face.
Yeah, littoral, I thought that was ocean and large lakes. Very large lakes.
I said there's a nuance. Hang tight.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. For a broad categorization in your mind, more often than not on the test purposes, think ocean for littoral. But really, littoral also includes the intercoastal waterways and very large lakes. And here's why, folks. The categories are based on tides. In other words, things that are affected by the moon. That kind of tide, not the rain. You can high tide in a river, but that's because of rain or other sources, okay? It's the things that are affected by gravitational pull and mood. High tide, low tide, on rhythm. That's littoral rights. Riparian is everything else. Yeah, Corey says, so littoral applies to lakes and seas. It applies to large lakes and seas, and that's where I'm telling you, on the test, some testing providers will tell you that lakes are riparian. Others will tell you that it's littoral. But fortunately, most won't ask the questions about those. They'll focus on the main categories like oceans versus creeks, like oceans versus ponds. So you're not as likely to see lakes because of the subjectivity of it. But yes, large lakes like the Great Lakes that are connected to estuaries, basins, and things of that nature fall under littoral under some context. But smaller lakes could be under riparian depending on your testing provider or otherwise. There you go. So let's start with riparian. And now that I provided the clarification, don't freak out on this next slide, okay? Riparian, depending on how you look at it, can include rivers, small lakes, streams, creeks, and I'll even throw in ponds. Okay? Things that are not affected by the moon or gravitational pull to dictate their water level. Things that are only affected by rain flow. So when we're dealing with riparian, folks, there is further categorization that needs to happen. We got to break it down a little bit more. Because we can all agree that a river and a creek are very different. You agree? Yeah. And so of these bodies of water, we break them down into what we call navigable versus non-navigable. Now, do not get confused with, I can put a boat in it, so it's navigable. No, I want you to think of this as the difference between your driveway and the highway. Okay, that's the way to think of this. We all agree that you can put a car in your driveway. Is it going to take you anywhere? No. But if you get on the highway, you're going from one point to another in your car. You agree? That's the exact way that I want you to think of non-navigable versus navigable bodies of water under riparian rights. So a river would be a navigable body of water. A creek and a pond would be a non-navigable body of water. You may have a creek big enough to put a kayak or something in it. That doesn't make it navigable. And a pond you can put a boat in, but because of the nature of those, you're not going anywhere. It's non-navigable. Now I'm going to tell you the kicker for, how these are testable when you get back from your next break. Whoop, whoop. So, we are currently talking about appurtenances. Remember, appurtenances are just anything that runs with the land, okay, right? Good, bad, uglies, a lot of different things are considered appurtenances. And one example of appurtenances are water rights. And the reason why is because whatever right that somebody has to a river, a creek, a stream, an ocean adjacent to their property or on their property will convey to the next person. It is interesting to note that these are the only ones that we're going to talk about really that are not severable. You cannot remove these rights from the property itself and retain them. Potentially other ones like subsurface rights you could, right? The right to mine, the right to oil, the right to things of that nature. But water rights, not so much. So we're dealing with riparian right now. And I told you, rivers, creeks, streams, ponds, depending on the materials, small lakes, sometimes the big lakes, are in littoral. And hopefully they're not going to try to trick you in that regard. You just got to be careful the way they word the question, which is why we're kind of approaching it this way. So here's what you need to know, okay? Non-navigable bodies of water and navigable bodies of water under riparian are treated very differently. And here's how. When we're dealing with a non-navigable body of water, you actually own into the water. Or, in other words, the land underneath it and by proxy the water above it. So if you've got a creek running in through, your property, you own that portion of the creek. If you've got a pond on your property, you own that pond. Stream, same thing. If you are dealing with navigable, that changes. So let me show you a visual here. If we've got a creek, a stream, or even a pond, like we have here, and let's say we had two adjacent lots where it lined up on, we'll just call it a pond, okay? You would own halfway into that water. This would be your half of the pond, the creek, the stream. This would be their half of the pond, the creek, the stream. Now, while you do both have ownership of your individual portion of this non-navigable body of water, it is important to note that you can't do anything to destroy the other party's ownership. Lot A could not drain the pond because that would cause damage to Lot B. But you could build decks on your respective sides. You could do whatever. In a nutshell, the way that this is always going to be looked at on a test is for a non-navigable riparian body of water, you own into the water. Now for a navigable body of water, I want you to picture it, folks. If you've ever been kayaking, tubing, or otherwise, you're on a river, you're going down the river, and then if you look on either side, depending which river you're in, you typically see houses, just like you see in this picture. It is very popular for people to build houses on rivers, but because those are what we would call a navigable body of water, their ownership only goes up to the edge of the water, the bank where it ends. They do not own into the water at all. That's the reason why you can tube through that water. They can't stop you. And that's why I told you, think of it like the driveway versus a highway. You can't park on somebody's driveway that's not yours, but nobody can stop you from driving through the highway. It is considered to be owned by the public. And so navigable bodies of water under riparian rights, you can't own into them. Now, sometimes you see things like docks coming off. It's important to note that these docks are granted by way of special use permits, and they are built into the public right-of-way. So technically they have to go through a process. Don't get so caught up on that. So they do own the dock because it's for their exclusive use, because it comes off their ownership of their property. You can't just go and use somebody's dock, but they can't do it without asking permission because they don't own into the river, the ocean, or whatever. Does that make sense? What you got, Jacob?
All right, so I have a question. With the navigable locations of water, bodies of water, right? So, I mean, say it's a big river or a big lake or whatnot. And, I mean, you know how lots of times there's like side branches and pieces like that, right? Is navigable and non-navigable, is that split up by the actual body of water, or can a body of water be split into multiple portions of navigable or non-navigable?
You mean like if it like branches off into creeks and other pieces?
I mean, not even necessarily like a creek. I mean, I know that there's lots of really big rivers and stuff like that that kind of branch off into much smaller areas where, you know, people like to build houses on or things like that. I mean, is that a situation that does my question make any sense?
It does, but don't worry about that because they're never going to test you on that in any way, shape, and form. Okay, it's either like the river is navigable or it's not, you know. And so if it's navigable, we're not going to differentiate to smaller sections, larger sections, you know, the way that it traverses. It's either that, you know, it is a navigable body of water that falls under riparian rights, meaning you only own up to the water's edge, or it is a non-navigable body of water that, you know, under riparian rights, that means you own the water itself. You own the land underneath the water. That's really the biggest focus for this. I mean, yeah, there's, of course, a million different nuances to this in the real world. It's not always so black and white, but for the test, it's this straightforward.
Okay, that makes sense. Follow-up question. So say, I mean, in this picture right here, Lot A and Lot B for navigable. The properties, I guess no, because the property just ends right there. Because I was thinking underneath the water where they meet in the middle, would that be? That makes sense.
Yeah. On this one, yeah, you own this land, right? That line is there. You own the land underneath the water. You own the water itself up to that line. On this one, you don't own anything in here. Your ownership dies right there. Your ownership dies right there. Yeah. Sam says, so the navigable situation, the public owns it. You don't need to differentiate that. It's not going to try to trick you on, you know, who the public is. It's just, it's for the public use. Yeah, the government technically owns it, right? But, of course, the problem with that is not just one body of government. The Savannah River traverses multiple states. You know, this river goes multiple states. So it's not like we can say, well, the federal government owns it. The federal government doesn't really care that much, but technically they do. The state government, it's just for public use. The public owns it. The government owns it. We're not going to ask you to differentiate between the individual governing bodies. Monica says, do they still go by mean high watermark? Hang tight. That's the next one. So there is no concern for mean high watermark in any way, shape, and form under riparian rights. Okay, it's just water's edge. That's how they go off of this for these navigable bodies of water. Now I told you, you know, creeks, ponds, streams. Just be careful with lakes and really read the question carefully because some materials articulate them differently. So. This is just reiterating what I told you. Difference is non-navigable, you can own into the water. Navigable, you own to the water's edge for riparian. So let's talk about the other ones. Littoral. Littoral is typically thought of as oceans, sounds, and bays. But some materials do include large lakes. It just typically has to deal with huge bodies of water that are affected by the tide, meaning it is on a cycle. If you've ever looked at the ocean, right, it says high tide is this time, low tide is this time, because it's predictable, because it's consistent, because it's based on things like the moon. Now, are they ever going to mention the moon in any way, shape, or form on the test? No. I'm just trying to help you to think of how to, differentiate these in your mind. So these littoral bodies of water, oceans, sounds, bays, yes, some Great Lakes. Folks, these are deemed always navigable. Okay, it is impossible to own into these bodies of water. Yet again, there may be docks, there may be, things of that nature that exist through special permitting. So here's the way that this works. If you, for example, look at beach property, okay, and you see all these individually private owned houses, these lot lines in between these docks, you do not own all of this. You don't. You own only up to, this is what Monica was just talking about, the mean high tide mark. Or in other words, the average high tide. And so that's why we can say this, because it's predictable. We know when it's high tide and when low tide is. And wherever the high tide line hits on average, that's where the ownership ends. So that means if you were walking here, you would be trespassing. If you were walking here, you would not be trespassing, because everything below the mean high tide mark and low tide is public. You have access to it. The individual landowners do not own it. That area is called the foreshore. Not like for sure, but foreshore, Foreshore. Okay, so ownership never goes into the water here. You own up to the average high tide mark, called the mean high tide. And so you think of somewhere like Emerald Isle, where it's like all residentially owned. Well, at low tide, as long as you didn't trespass to get there, technically they can't legally stop you from walking along the beach on low tide in those areas. Now, please don't test this theory, because not everybody understands littoral rights. And yet again, you might have a tendency to come back with more holes than you started with, because people don't understand this. So don't test it, okay? But that's the way that this works. Anybody who owns land or property adjacent to an ocean or an intercoastal waterway or something like that, they own up to the average high tide line. Everything below that is public access, government owned, whatever you'd like to call it. Now, without a doubt, folks, these two, littoral rights and riparian rights, are the most testable in every way, shape, and form on your test. They're not going to be crazy amounts of questions on this, but they are testable without a doubt. The reason I'm telling you that is because I'm going to give you number 3 here, but number 3 is one that, some people like to teach it, some people don't. I'll tell you this, there's periods of time where I've gone for years without talking about this, and it's never been an issue. But with this new testing provider, I just wanted to be on the safe side, because I don't know if they have this in here. So there's what we call a doctrine of prior appropriation, which basically states something along the lines of the first person who got access to a body of water, their rights can't be impeded by subsequent users. So let's say that, we had a river like this, and this farmer funneled stuff off from the river, and they, were using, 17,000 gallons a day or whatever it may be. Somebody couldn't come up higher up in the river and build a dam and prevent him from getting his use out of it. That's basically what that means, okay? Secondary and subsequent users of the body of water cannot do anything to impede the first user of the water. There's other, things with this in Western states where you can't just use water without permission from the government. But you're not going to get any more detail than this for the doctrine of prior appropriation. This is all you really need to know. And you probably won't even see anything on it. So since we're talking about water, before we switch gears and start talking about other different appurtenances, I do want to bring in some vocabulary into the mix that is considered testable. And it all deals with water, okay? This is level 1. This is recall. You've just got to be able to identify what it is. It's never going to be in depth. And for the love of all things, let's not go off on tangents on this because you don't really need to know the actual reasoning or how this could happen. It's just verbiage, okay? There's 4 of them. 4 things that you need to know in regard to what water could do to land. So let's start with accretion. And I want you to look at the kind of these words in the middle. C-R-E, a credit, okay? To give, to deposit, it's a credit. So accretion is a gradual increase in land from a deposit of soil. So if, soils were brought from upriver, downriver, and deposited in a certain area, that would be an accretion. The soil would increase because of silt deposits, land deposits, things of that nature. Once again, do not ask for specifics. You don't need them. Just know that accretion means a deposit of soils from water, okay? Water deposit, move soil from one place to another place. Reliction is the increase of land from water reducing. So there's that word. Reduction of water increases the land. Folks, I'm going to tell y'all something. I mentioned this, I think, yesterday, but my past couple days have been chaotic. I have a house down in Georgia, and I have 80 acres. And the reason I'm telling you this is because I can use that property for a lot of examples that are going to come up throughout this course. But I have a 5-acre pond on that property. If I was to drain that pond, I would have 5 more acres of usable land. It's not the only way that this happens. If somebody was to dam up a river, that would be the increase of land from the river being dammed up. Same thing, draining a lake or whatever. It's just reducing the water and exposing more land that makes you have more land. Erosion, you're all familiar with. It is a gradual reduction in land. Think the Grand Canyon. The Arizona River ran through it over millions of years and has eroded it to what it is now. So it is not a fast process. It's just the river moving sediment and water and removing soils and causing the soils to erode away, to be removed, to increase the water flow and decrease the land. And then the last one is called avulsion, which kind of sounds like avalanche, AV. It is a catastrophe. It is a natural disaster. It is a sudden thing. Landslide, hurricane, tsunami, flood, something has caused a sudden and abrupt loss of your land. And so if a hurricane comes through and rips out so much sand and soils from, that property you own, when that happens, there is this potential right to restore your previous property line as long as your municipalities, don't say it's not a problem. So let's say a hurricane comes through and you lost 20 feet of beach. You would be allowed to restore that 20 feet of lost beach based on that act of avulsion, of that rapid and sudden loss of property. Now, some beaches have, rules and policies against restorations, but that's not going to be testable in any way, shape, or form. So there you go. This is verbiage, vocabulary only. Know what they are. It's going to be a question like, which of the following would be the sudden and abrupt loss of land? It would be avulsion. Which of the following is the gradual reduction of land through bodies of moving water? Erosion. Very much vocabulary questions. Not super in-depth in any way, shape, or form. You're not going to be asked scenarios. So let me introduce 2 pieces of verbiage here that are going to pertain to what we're about to talk about. We just talked about water rights, okay? Water rights, we're talking about appurtenances. If I own a home with a pond and I sell it to, who have I not picked on today? Stephanie. If I sell it to Stephanie, Stephanie would now own that pond. If I own a house on the beach, and I sell to Adriana, Adriana would now own that beach access, right? Those littoral rights up to that edge. So those were appurtenances. Well, we're still talking about appurtenances. We're about to get into subsurface rights. But unlike water rights, subsurface rights can be severed. When I say severed, it means you can remove them and take them with you when you go. So in other words, I'm not giving them to the new owner. Well, water rights don't have that ability per se. Subsurface rights are severable. Well, there's a couple important concepts that come to, subsurface rights and, adjacent ownership. So when we're dealing with subsurface rights, I want you to picture this. If I own a property and there was oil underneath it, I could sell off the right to mine that oil to another person. So that's why I'm saying they are severable. And if that other person comes and puts an oil refinery, mine, mill, or whatever the heck they're called on my property, they would have to afford me the right of subjacent support. They could not do anything to the property that would destroy the rest of my property. So they couldn't drill a mine directly under my house that would cause my house to crumble. But they do have the right to get the oil because I gave them that right. They couldn't, cause the rest of the property to cave in on itself. That's the right of subjacent support. Somebody who has the right to your subsurface rights can't do anything to destroy the rest of your property's integrity. Okay? Subjacent, right here. Lateral support is your neighbors. Because I own my property, you own your property, but they touch each other, I can't do anything to my property that would have caused your property to erode away, to be disrupted, to cause major issues. Otherwise, there could be some problems. You could potentially take me to court. And so let me give the biggest examples of the right of lateral support. In areas that you all live in, you've probably seen development. And when a new subdivision is going in, they always put up a silt fence perimeter. Why? Because as they clear out all this vegetation and open it all up, they're trying to prevent all of the dirt from flowing into the neighboring property and all of your dirt from being washed away from your property down into their work sites. So they're trying to put up these. Now, some developers are better than others and some don't put up fences and you still have problems. But that is the right of lateral support. Okay, can't do anything that would destroy the structural integrity of your neighboring property. Right of subjacent support. The person who has rights to do things on your property can't do anything to mess it up completely. So let's talk about these subsurface rights, okay? These go hand in hand with it. So subsurface, sub means below. So subsurface means the rights below the surface. Well, I told you when you own real property, you own the dirt. What that means is if there is gold in the dirt, it's your gold. If there's oil in the dirt, it's your oil. If there's lithium in the dirt, it's your lithium. When you own your subsurface rights, you own the rights to all the minerals and anything that might be of value down below, good, bad, or otherwise. Of course, water as well. You could potentially put a well down there. Well, these are things that can be severed off. And so in the example I just gave you, if you wanted to sell it off to an oil company, think of the Beverly Hillbillies. Folks, y'all remember that show? Jacob, have you ever heard of the Beverly Hillbillies? Here's the real test. You know what the Beverly Hillbillies are?
Heard of it, never seen it.
Okay, heard of it, never seen it. I'll take that. Folks, the premise of the Beverly Hillbillies was a bunch of rednecks, okay, just a living in Texas, I presume, in the sticks. And he was shooting at a possum or a squirrel or something. And when he shot at this little critter, he shot the ground because he missed it. And oil came up. And because he owned that land, that was his oil. Now, he could have retained the land and just sold the oil rights to a company, but he sold the whole parcel of land, and he took all the millions, which would probably equate to billions nowadays that he made, and they moved to Beverly Hills, 90210, right? California. And the hilarity ensued. A bunch of rednecks, hillbillies, living in Beverly Hills. It was hilarious. Gotta watch it. So subsurface rights can be severed from the property. If you want to, if you find out that you have gold under your property, you could sell just the rights to mine the gold to somebody and you could keep the rest of your property. If you found out there was lithium, you could sell the rights to mine the lithium and keep the rest of your property. If you wanted to, you could sell the whole property to somebody else, but you could retain those mining rights yourself. And that's where I tell you they're severable. There's a lot of different things you can do. Just like those bundle of legal rights, that deep sea concept could be removed, so can these. So any resource, and you wanted to give away the right to somebody else to utilize it, that would be severing these subsurface rights. Now, we'll talk more about this when we get into a North Carolina specific concept called the Residential Property Disclosure Act. There is a disclosure on whether or not properties have had their mineral, oil, and gas rights severed from the property. And the reason that disclosure exists is because there was a builder once upon a time that was sneakily severing the mineral, oil, and gas rights away from the property when they sold them. Now, I'll tell you more about that in a little bit. Air rights. I told you you have air rights to your property as well. Well, this is a little more of an abstract concept, but here's a visual to help you understand it. If this hotel owns this property, and then what you can't see over here is a parking deck that they also own. These are probably owned by the government. And so they probably had to go to the government and purchase the right to build this over their property. That is air rights. You can't just do that. You would have to purchase the right. Somebody would have to give you the right to build over their property. And so this is also sometimes comes into effect when we're dealing with building things like these high rises. Folks, there are sometimes city ordinances that don't allow you to just automatically build something this giant. Because while it may not affect anybody else's air rights because you own that, there is also this legal concept of visibility. If there's a house over here and you build something like that, they can't see anymore. So sometimes it gets into specifics of, zoning and visibility and sunshine and a lot of other things. But this is just a really prime example of air rights, is the right to build above your property or utilize above your property. This will matter a lot more if we ever go, as I said before, to the way of the Jetsons, where everything's like floating on the sky, because whoever owns the ground would own everything up above it. Do understand, though, this is limited. Yes, you do own your air rights, but not to the extent where you could say, well, no airplanes are allowed to fly over my house. You don't have that right. Airplanes are allowed to fly over your house. You cannot restrict that. But you can restrict other people developing above your property, building over your property, bridges or otherwise, things of that nature.
So is it basically the permanence of the thing that dictates whether or not it is on your property? Or
you're just talking about like an airplane just flying over temporarily versus a permanent structure?
Yeah, I mean an airplane or anything else passing through the air versus a permanent structure. It's the permanence that makes it.
Yeah, it's the permanence that's the issue. So yeah, you don't have the authority to restrict anything from flying over your house. But you do have the authority to restrict something permanent like this from going over your house. So all of these different rights are potentially appurtenances, okay? If you own the air rights and when you sell the property, you don't sever them, they're pertinent, they move on to the next person. Same thing with subsurface, same thing with water, okay? All of these are appurtenances if not severed, if they're even possible. Well, let's get into the other type that I talked about. I mentioned fixtures, and so I earlier said, why do we need to differentiate or distinguish between real property and personal property? More than anything is because people want to know, if I buy this house, what comes with it? That's really it. Do I get this? Do I get that? Are these shelves staying? Is that TV staying? Is this staying? Is that staying? And so the way that we have this conversation is, well, we have to determine if it's real property or not. Because, folks, if it is part of the real property, if it's part of the improvement, then it's an appurtenance and it stays. But if it's not part of the real property, then it's not an appurtenance and it goes. So if I buy your house, you're not leaving your couch for me. It's not part of the real property. It is personal property. But, folks, do you think you would be taking out your kitchen cabinets before you sell your house? Better not. No. because it is attached to the real property. It is considered real property. It is an appurtenance. So the biggest question that we have to answer is, well, is this item real property or not? And some of them are obvious and some of them are not as obvious. So we're going to get into some very detailed conversations about this more down the road, but understand that in the real estate world, obvious, not obvious, doesn't really matter. At the end of the day, we just need to be sure that we're all on the same page. We need to clarify. Because it is very possible to ask for somebody's couch in a transaction. It's happened. It's very possible to ask for somebody's car in a transaction. It's very possible to ask for somebody's TV, so on and so forth. So what it ultimately comes down to is, what did we say was going to happen in the contract? Because things that are considered part of the real property are sometimes allowed to leave if we agree to it. Things that should not be considered part of the real property are sometimes allowed to stay if we agree to it. And I'm going to touch more on that in a minute. So as I said earlier, personal property is anything that is not real property. It is typically identified as movable items. Couches, cars, furniture, your clothes, your books, your computer, your desks, your chairs. All of these things are personal property. So here's that vocabulary word that I told you I was going to introduce in a moment. Chattel. Folks, chattel is just a word that means movable personal property. Now, let me tell you the silly little way to remember it, okay? Chattel sounds like cattle, and it is movable personal property. You see how that works there? There you go. Chattel sounds like cattle, and it is movable personal property. The other name for personal property is personalty. Yet again, I don't know why we have so many weird, quirky real estate words that come into play here, but you do potentially need to know that word as well. Because if they start talking about personalty on the test, they mean personal property. If they start talking about chattel on the test, they mean personal property. And so here's where we can really just make this black and white, but then I've got to give you a little gray. If it is personal property in a real estate transaction, it's leaving with whom?
Seller.
The seller. So the seller sells you their house, and they had all these items like their couch, their clothes, their cars, their furniture, their cats, their dogs, their, whatever. That's all going to leave with them. But as I told you, real estate, let me tell you one of the weirdest things that you need to know about real estate. Now, this is not necessarily as testable as it is just a warning about what you're getting into. Everything in real estate is negotiable. Literally everything. If we agree to it, we can do it. And so what that means is there are certain things that are absolutely personal property, but I just told you we've negotiated it before. So there's the default setting, and the default setting is very testable, right? If I asked you what's happening to the couch at closing, you know the default says it leaves with the seller. But if I asked you, can the buyer end up with the couch at closing? The answer is yes. All they have to do is put it in the contract. There is a default setting for everything. What will happen by default if we say nothing is going to be the most testable. But you also have to have this thorough understanding of how everything can be changed if given the right information in a test question. That's funny. Jacob says, my girlfriend's parents years ago bought a farm that the seller would only sell if they took his dog who grew up on the farm. I've heard of the same thing. People, goats and pets and things of that. It does happen. So let me tell you why I put this picture up here, folks. In North Carolina, not every state, but in North Carolina, a refrigerator is personal property. Under normal circumstances, it leaves with the seller. Now, that is one of the most common things that we would potentially ask for in a contract, right? We would say, hey, we know it's personal property and it's supposed to leave with the seller. But as buyers, we're asking, would you leave it for us? And if everybody agrees to it in the contract, that's what will happen. But this is where I told you, the default is the most testable. Buyer and seller close on a piece of real property. Where's the fridge? With the seller. If we don't tell you anything otherwise, it left with the seller because it's personal property in North Carolina. So now let me introduce the word fixture. Well, folks, what comes to mind when I say the word fixture?
Like a light or ceiling fan.
There you go. Typically, light fixture, because that's what we all call her. Light fixture. Especially if you're from the South. Light fixture. A fixture is something that at one time was personal property, but has now been affixed to the real property, making it part of the real property. Can we all agree that if I got in my truck and I drove to Home Depot right now, and I got 6 brand new ceiling fans, and they were sitting in the back of my truck, those 6 boxes of ceiling fans are my personal property. You agree with me? But when I take those 6 ceiling fans out of the boxes and I install them into the house that I currently own, they become a fixture. They are now part of the house. And as part of the house, they would convey to the next person. So that makes them part of the real property. That makes them an appurtenance. What you got, Dora?
I've seen them where they actually have taken the lights and stuff like that, especially that chandelier of such. There are some sellers that have. What happens in that case?
Now, I'm going to answer your question, but I'm also going to preface it with, what did I tell you on day 1?
Depends.
Depends.
Well, no, I told you, listen to this. Don't worry about what you've seen in the past.
Yeah.
Yeah, but here's the answer. Everything, as I just mentioned seconds ago, is negotiable. If sellers took their fans with them without permission, they were in breach of a legal contract. But if they got permission, they have the right to take them. That's going to introduce the 2 very important words that are coming up on my next slide. So it's a really good question. I'm just picking on you. You can always ask questions. Please don't feel like you can't. But I mean, folks, weird things happen in real estate transactions all the time. So when you attach it to the house, the generalization is it's now a fixture. It's now part of the real property. And so if I attach all these ceiling fans and, God, I feel like I picked on everybody today. Manoj comes and buys my property. I'm leaving the fans for Manoj. If we don't have an agreement to the contrary, it's part of the house. They're his now. So the generalization for what a fixture is, or what constitutes a fixture. Now, folks, listen to me. This is for the test only. The real world is way more complicated than this. But the generalization is if you look at something and it is nailed, screwed, glued, or buried, it is probably a fixture for test purposes. So your light fixtures are a fixture. Your kitchen cabinets are a fixture. Your flooring is fixtures. Your trees in the yard are fixtures. If it's nailed, screwed, glued, or buried. Refrigerator, personal property. Couch, personal property. Pictures hanging on the walls, not attached to the walls, but hanging, personal property. You see kind of the trend here? But everything is negotiable. Kirsten, you look like you have a question.
Yeah, I was going to ask, what about a stove?
In North Carolina, a stove is a fixture.
A fixture, okay.
Yeah. Stoves are fixtures, and microwave hood vents, like the attached ones, those are fixtures. Freestanding microwave sitting on your counter, personal property. Dishwasher, fixture. The only appliances that are typically considered personal property in North Carolina, refrigerator, washer, dryer. And of course, a microwave sitting on the top. So if you buy, go ahead.
So with that being said, that means that we can't remove, say, the stove, or if we were to put in the, we still couldn't put it in the contract saying that we want to take the stove with us, or it's not a part of the sale.
You can. And that's why you have to understand the default is where your brains need to stay, but you have to be able to follow the variances, the nuances. So that's all it would take. So I just said that I don't like to use the stove as an example, and I'll tell you why in a second, but let's say this chandelier. What if that's a $12,000 chandelier that I bought, and I don't want to leave it for the next buyer? Folks, all it takes is for us to come to an agreement. Hey, yes, we know that this is a fixture that's supposed to stay. I want to take it with me when I go. Buyer says, I'm okay with that, no problem. We have it in the contract. Yes, I can now take it. But if we don't have that agreement and I take it, I am in breach of contract because I removed something that was considered part of the house that was supposed to go to them by default. Yeah.
And usually when that happens, the buyer can negotiate a lower selling price.
Well, the selling price has already been negotiated at the time that we're under contract. Now, of course, we're going to have some very in-depth conversations about what happens when somebody's in breach of contract. There are remedies, is what we call them, remedies. There are rights that the buyer would have, which may include trying to renegotiate, may include suing the seller, it may include a lot of other things. But there are remedies for when you don't do what you say you're going to do. Yeah. Yeah, for sure. So here's two pieces of verbiage that come into play here, okay? I told you, if I buy this beautiful chandelier from a light store and it's in the back of my car, number one, it's probably going to break. But I digress. If it's in the back of my car, it is personal property. But when I attach it to the house, that is called real property, right? It becomes real property. The term for attaching it and it becoming part of the real property is called annexation. When you take personal property and attach it to the real property, and it becomes part of the real property, or it becomes a fixture, it's called annexation. What you got, Manoj?
All the wall paintings, everything, was that considered as a fixture?
Nope, because wall paintings are not screwed into the wall. There are nails or screws, but they're just sitting there. So those are all personal property. Yep. Oh, good question. Kingsley said, is the Ring doorbell camera a fixture or personal property? It's a fixture because it is attached to the house. Dora, you look like you're panicking now. Did you just mess up a negotiation with the Ring doorbell camera? Like as soon as I said that, you're just like.
No, I heard him speaking about it, and I put it together. I was putting it together in my head. That's like it was a fixture, though. But
oh no, not you, Corey. I'm sorry. No, you're not you, Corey. You're good. Dora was the one that looked panicky.
Yeah, one of our homes that was sold not too long ago. I was like, when you said that, I was like, wait a minute.
Yeah. There you go.
It was a thought.
Yeah, I completely understand. There's a lot of epiphanies that happen in these classes.
Well, yeah. You wouldn't think it would be, but.
Well, wouldn't the Ring doorbell be considered subjective because of the way that it can be attached to the property? So, for instance, like some are actually installed, the others they just kind of like you can place it onto the door. Like, well, I guess in the same sense as a picture, you would still like screw it or nail it onto the door, but it's not attached.
That's an excellent question, Josh. Y'all ready for this? Folks, listen to me. The generalization for your test is nailed, screwed, glued, or buried, but I told you it is way more specific in the real world. In the real world, we have a freaking list in North Carolina. You ready for this? This is the freaking list of things that are fixtures. Now, we're not going to go over the freaking list right now, but look at the very first one. Alarms and security systems attached for security, fire, smoke, carbon monoxide, or other toxins, with all related access codes, sensors, cameras, dedicated monitors, hard drive, video recorders, power supplies, cables, doorbells, and chimes. And it does say up here, it includes all traditional and smart versions. So on this list, a doorbell is a fixture, and that includes smart doorbells. Now, folks, this is a very North Carolina specific contract you're looking at, which is why I'm saying for the test, the generalization for is it a fixture, is it nailed, screwed, glued, or buried? And if it is, it's probably a fixture for test taking purposes. In the real world, it can be state specific on what is and what is not, because we have these detailed lists and these very specific contracts, these standardized forms that we have drafted that we use. What you got, Jacob?
So you can tell me that this is irrelevant because it's kind of an odd question. But so say an apartment complex, some apartment complexes will allow you to install something such as a Ring doorbell. When you do so, it is now a fixture here in the state of North Carolina. Does that mean when you move, you're required by law to leave that there?
No. Let me make, and so that's not a relevant question, but let me make a very strong statement, folks. And I said it again, but I need you to listen to me. There is a default setting without agreement to the contrary what would happen. But we can always have an agreement to the contrary. Always. And you're going to have to understand that because I'm going to get into some of the very special categories of fixtures. And you're going to be like, well, that doesn't seem fair. I don't like it. I don't care if you don't like it. But if the test asks you a question on how is this going to be treated, you're going to have to answer it appropriately. So it would depend, Jacob, at the end of the day, it would depend what was in your lease agreement. If your lease agreement says that if you install it, you have to leave it, then you'd have to leave it. If your lease agreement says install it, take it down, we don't give a crap, then it doesn't matter. So there is default settings if we have not discussed it. But everything is negotiable in real estate. There are very few absolutes in this course. So for instance, if I have a test question that says, the seller attached a chandelier 10 years ago that is in the dining room. And he got under contract with buyer A. At closing, the seller removed, or prior to closing, the seller removed the chandelier and did not leave it. Which of the following would be true in regard to this scenario? The seller's in breach of contract because he removed a fixture, okay? That's the default setting. If I give you no other information to contradict it, that chandelier was a fixture, you need to know that that's a problem. But if I said that there was a chandelier in the property, and then the buyer and seller negotiated and agreed that the seller could take it with them when they left, and then the seller, took it with them and replaced it with it, then you're going to have to say, okay, well, that's not a problem. There are contradictions to everything. If we give you enough information, you can understand that it's okay. It's just if we don't give you information, you've got to know where you have to default your brain setting to. So
in other words, don't read too much into the question, just what the question asks, just go with what it says.
There you go. Let me rephrase that in a more politically correct way. Do not ever put things into the question that are not there. That's what you need to understand. You only have the facts. Do not ever look at the question and be like, well, what if this person was a millionaire and maybe they won it from a lottery and then their grandmother was dying on their deathbed and so they were under duress, and so if they were under duress then maybe the contract is voidable because grandma's dying. Don't put things in the question that aren't there. You will kill yourself on the test. All you have is the facts. And you have to default to where I'm telling you your brain needs to go if you do not have any information to the contrary. Because if there's no agreement and the seller was to remove a chandelier, it's a problem because that was a fixture. Because it was nailed, screwed, glued, or buried. If there's an agreement that allowed them to remove it, that's not a problem because they were given permission to do it. Everybody with me? So the verbiage here, annexation is to take a piece of personal property and attach it to the real estate, and so now it's part of the real property. And so that means that that is now an appurtenance. It runs with the land. The chandelier is an appurtenance. The house is an appurtenance. These fixtures are appurtenances. But if we were given permission to remove it, removing a piece of real property and converting it back to personal property is called severance. When I say severance, it's to sever. As morbid as it sounds, if you were to take a big old machete and go, you just severed your hand from the rest of your body. That's what it means. To sever it from the rest of the real estate. To sever it from the rest of the appurtenances. So with the appropriate agreements, these things could be severed and turned back into personal property. Or they can be severed illegally, and then there's repercussions, which we'll talk about more when we get to basic contract law. Now, let me help you with the defaults, and this is the last big lesson I'm going to give you for tonight. If we're putting an offer in on a property for a buyer, do we need to ask for the kitchen cabinets?
No.
No. Because they are affixed. They are a fixture, which means they should automatically come to this buyer. If we're putting in an offer in for a buyer, do we need to clarify that the seller is going to remove the couch when they go?
No.
No. Folks, we only need to talk about these things if we want them to do the opposite of the default. If it's personal property, why are we going to put it in the contract that specifically state seller has to remove the couch? We don't have to state that. They know it's their couch. Just like you don't need to ask for the cabinets, you know they're coming with the real property. So the only time we talk about personal property on the contract is if we want it to do the opposite of what it's supposed to default to. In other words, you want the seller to leave personal property for the buyer. That's the only time we talk about personal property in the contract. Otherwise, we don't need to talk about it. So by that same logic, when is the only time we need to talk about fixtures on the contract?
If you're going to take it with you as the seller.
If we're allowing the seller to take it with them, if the seller wants to take it with them. Do you understand this mentality of default? We do not need to ask for fixtures. They default to staying. We do not need to clarify that personal property is leaving. It defaults to leaving. The only time we mention fixtures and personal property on the contract is if we want them to do the opposite of what they are intended to do, of what they default to doing. And that's why I'm telling you, your brains have to default to this very important place. But then you have to be able to follow a chain of events to say, okay, are we doing something different than the default? Better with me. What you got, Adriana?
So, you were talking earlier about a TV that is attached to the wall with a wall mount. So, it's a personal property, but it is attached to the wall. And I know that normally it does not stay unless you ask, but isn't it attached to the wall?
First and foremost, I love the way you say attached. It's adorable with your accent. Secondly, yes, but so in North Carolina, the clarification is the wall mount is a fixture that you have to leave, but the TV can be removed and take it with you. It's kind of like the same thing as like a picture on the wall. There is a screw in the wall, but this is just sitting on that screw. And so if you look right here, surface mounting brackets for television and speakers, recessed mounted speakers, and mounted intercom systems. The mounting brackets in North Carolina are considered fixtures. You are allowed to take your TVs with you, leave the brackets. There you go. Good question. Now that being said, folks, we got all kinds of amazing and fantastical things to keep on rocking and rolling. Let me talk about where we're going to get to as I answer these other questions. Sandeep, what you got?
So my question is, whose responsibility is it to keep track of what stays and what doesn't? Buyers?
The broker, right?
What am I that none of y'all are yet? A broker.
Okay.
Yeah, the broker. Folks, this is one of the most important parts of our jobs, okay? Because listen, if you are helping somebody buy a house and they really want that refrigerator in North Carolina, well, you as a real estate broker have to be smart enough to know that we have to ask for that refrigerator in North Carolina. Now listen, if you're a dingleberry with a capital D and you don't do that, guess what's not going to be there on the day of closing? The refrigerator. Guess whose fault that's going to be? The buyer's agent. Guess who's about to buy the most expensive closing gift they've ever bought in their life because they're sorry, they're so stupid, and they didn't ask for the refrigerator. They thought it was a fixture. That's part of our job.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Yeah, great question. What you got, Jacob?
So right now, as we're talking about these, we're talking about a couple of different things. We're talking about a couple things that are here just exclusively for North Carolina, and we're also talking about a couple of things that are national, right? I mean, it's national that these are fixtures or whatever, right? But it's also North Carolina specific that the Ring doorbells are fixtures. So my question, when we're looking or talking about the test, is this sort of thing going to be on the state or the national portion?
So if you've been noticing, I've been very specific in my words, right? I've been saying this is specific to North Carolina, and I've been saying, you have to understand, Jacob, it is a bifurcated exam. It is two separate pieces. You will know when you're answering questions about national concepts. You will know when you're answering questions about state concepts whenever you take the actual test. And so I am going to train you throughout this entire class on where your brain needs to sit. Now, to go a little bit further, that's where I'm telling you that specific list will be pertinent to potentially North Carolina specific testing questions. Nailed, screwed, glued, buried, fixtures, annexation, severance, all that is national. The fact that you can still take personal property with you, that's national. It's just the very specific things of, well, in North Carolina, a refrigerator is real or personal property. Well, in North Carolina, that's where you have to differentiate. Everything that I've been saying, except for those very specific pieces of in North Carolina, are national concepts. Yeah.